welcome to Vicenza, welcome to the NATO ACT COE, and thank you very much for being here. As I mentioned before, as we have already mentioned before, the conference you are about to attend will revolve around spoiler threats, likely to affect our area of work if underestimated or not properly assessed. By looking at the agenda you have been provided with, you can easily identify how this topic enjoys the highest level of importance for those actors directly involved in developing activities in support of the host nation police forces and, more in general, in the wider field of public security. So this is the subject of this conference. Mr. Michael Dziedzic will address the subject more thoroughly later on, but let's start by first shortly identifying what a spoiler threat is. The Oxford Dictionary defines a spoiler threat like something which destroys or diminishes the value or the quality of something else. Clearly, in our case, the something, in brackets, is the process by which the international community supports the host nation police forces to get on their feet, so to speak, and to undertake their regular tasks, effectively working towards the creation of a safe and secure environment, the so-called SASE, under which the local populace can live and continue its existence as normally as possible, albeit under challenging environmental circumstances. The latter is crucial. The sooner people will enjoy a level of safety which will enable them to move on, the quicker the theater of operations will stabilize and allow the international community to recalibrate the scope of its intervention and make the best use of its limited resources, because actually resources are always limited and we need to optimize them. With this in mind, it's easy to understand the importance of identifying and assessing spoiler threats as soon as possible, to prevent them from occurring or to identify suitable harm reduction strategies so that their impact on the overall success of a mission is minimal. This concept introduces the two-day workshop that will start tomorrow and build on the outcomes on the conference to work on possible solutions and common standards to address this challenge. The end product will serve as a base for the NATO Stability Policing Center of Excellence, the NATO ACT COE, to produce a doctrinal study that will serve as a conceptual framework for the assessment of spoiler threats for the benefit of the organizations that are represented here today and for the wider international community. Thank you for your attention, and I really wish you all a good conference and a good debate in order to have the best possible outcome out of this incredible audience here today. Thank you very much.
Alessandro, could you join me? Everybody, SACT from NATO, Supplied Allied Command Transformation, is the customer of the conference. Alessandro will talk a little bit about it. And therefore, we were hoping to have with us Major General Sefik Atak. However, due to circumstances, he cannot join us. But who can join us, Alessandro, thank you for coming, our subject matter expert from ACT on stability policing, and he will address you on his behalf. Alessandro.
Thank you, everybody. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Di Stefano. I'm the Stability Policing Subject Matter Expert in ACT Norfolk. Major General Sefik Atak is not able to participate due to concurrent and unforeseen commitments, but he apologized himself and asked me to deliver this short speech in line with the guidelines given by our Dutch friends. So, outstanding civil and military authorities, distinguished colleagues and dear guests, on behalf of SACT, General Andrea Lanata, please allow me to salute and thank all the prestigious representatives of the major international institutions who, with their presence at this important event, testify once again the commitment and importance of always seeking synergies aimed at preserving the peace worldwide. I thank the director of NATO's PSOD, Colonel Andrea Paris, for having thought and organized this ambitious conference. When we have talked often in the past months, and recognizes the high value of the event, ACT is very pleased to be the promoter and customer of the outcomes of the conference. As all of you is aware of, NATO recently celebrated 70 years of international peace and prosperity, and is as committed as ever to keep our people safe. NATO is operating in a constantly evolving and unpredictable geostrategic environment. ACT works to position the alliance for future success based on the enduring values of freedom, democracy, and the rule of law that have made NATO the most successful military alliance in history. ACT works to ensure NATO has the right military instrument of power to guarantee a credible and adaptable posture today and in the future, serving as the warfare development command that prepares the alliance to meet the challenges of the future. In order to achieve this ambitious goal, NATO collaboration with international organizations and NGOs is essential. The need to provide for the coverage, even at the strategic level, of stability policing arises from the awareness that more and more often in the context of NATO military operation, soldiers are no longer faced with an enemy in uniform, but contexts in which the main local institutions have collapsed or otherwise unable to operate. And NATO must be able to carry out its 360-degree tasks, those also interacting with civil institutions and above all, with the population. To cover stability policing at the strategic level, ACT recently delivered to the Military Committee a stability policing concept, which is currently under evaluation by international military staff. The 2016 Warsaw Summit is considered by ACT as one of the milestones for the need of SP at strategic level. Establishing a stability policing capability within NATO would also mean creating the basis for greater interaction with other international organizations, UN, EU, and EU, through the development of common standards that will subsequently facilitate the transfer of authority to the aforementioned international organization. In 2014, the NOC approved the Security Forces System concept, aimed at developing the capability to train and to develop local forces in crisis zones, so that local authorities are able, as quick as possible, to maintain security on their own. In the document, local forces address indigenous non-NATO military security forces. Within the scope, it is clearly mentioned that while the training of non-NATO military indigenous force should be considered the primary responsibility of other relevant national or international organizations, there may be circumstances that preclude those organizations from immediately undertaking this responsibility. In such circumstances, NATO may decide to fill the gap until the conditions allow for the transfer of that responsibility to the appropriate organization. These responsibilities normally lie with relevant actors like the UN and the EU-AU. The NATO SP concept takes into account that NATO efforts in such a field should be articulated in complement with these actors. And this is the main reason why we are here all together. We all are a part of the comprehensive approach aimed at obtaining a safe and secure environment, no overlapping, no duplication of efforts, no wasting of resources, no redundancies. On the contrary, under an holistic approach, the integration and coherent capability development among the main stakeholders in the field of public safety and security is of paramount importance to save money and time, obtaining the final results we want to achieve. The importance of non-state actors as NATO partners is expected to increase significantly as NATO continues to focus on projecting stability using federated network. In this context, NATO cooperation with the EU, UN, international national law enforcement agencies, and working with other international organizations and NGOs will require the alliance to implement a comprehensive approach. Spoiler threats are certainly factors that can affect the achievement of NATO, UN, EU missions. UN mission studies clarify that 80% of 25 internal conflicts that the UN has intervened since 1980 have been severely challenged by spoilers in the form of criminalized power structures. When NATO has been involved, the total is 100%. Thus, there is a strong prospect that future NATO missions will be obstructed by spoilers in the form of criminalized power structures. On 25 February 2019, the International Military Staff held a meeting to discuss NATO-UN cooperation. As a result of this meeting, one of the actions stated is that ACT is encouraged to explore the ways to engage COEs to interact with the UN more proactively. This conference follows this course of action. Active engagement between NATO and UN are already in place. Last year, ACT-SP-SME and the UN Police Division, UN Police Advisor, discussed about ACT-SP concept, and the UN showed interest on further collaboration with NATO to identify common capacity standards, gender-based violence, intelligence-led policing, community policing, high-risk arrest, through the UN SPC in Brindisi. HQ-SACT's intention is to develop these standards during the SP concept implementation phase. ACT therefore welcomes the creation of a community of interest in the field of stability policing. Any NATO SPCOE collaboration with the UN, EU, AU, but also with other national and international key players working in the particular sectors will be an added value for the Alliance, helping to achieve a coherent, effective, and efficient approach to the international security issues. I conclude wishing everyone a good job, being sure that the results will be qualitatively in line with the high-level standards always expressed by the NATO SPCOE. Thank you.
Michael, ready to go?
Well, I was just typing in that.
Well, why don't you finish, but Michael, why don't you finish that shortly? Well, I don't really think you have questions to yourself, actually, but you never know. Just a little bit of Michael, if I may, Michael, having 20 years of experience in the international civil, military, and stabilization field. I'm reading this because I cannot, let's say, remember everything. Michael, we had some positions at being the professor of the Air Force Academy, National War College, Georgetown University, and the George Mason University. And I hope you were asked for all these positions instead of, let's say, finding another one because you had to, but I don't think so. You were the Senior Fellow and Senior Program Officer at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Institute for National Strategic Studies, and the US Institute of Peace. Most recent publications are Criminalized Power Structures and the Overlooked Enemies of Peace and Combated Criminalized Power Structures. Michael is going to introduce us in the essential characteristic of the spoiler threats, so we will learn more about spoiler threats. And Michael, we all know this time schedule, correct? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Harry. Well, it's an extraordinary privilege for me to have the opportunity to address this august audience about a topic that is, if we are successful, will dramatically increase our capability to have successful peace and stability operations. Before I get started, I'm going to throw Aaron a cue ball here, or a screwball, that I taught, as Aaron mentioned, for many years at the Air Force Academy, and I was always enormously grateful for any flicker of interest on the part of cadets. So questions don't bother me. So Aaron will count the time that we spend answering any questions from the audience, and that will be subtracted from the amount of time that I'm speaking. But anyway, please, if you have a question or an interjection that you want to make, you don't have to type in that code word. You can just ask me while I'm speaking, and we'll address it right away. Next, that's what I needed. All right. So why is this such a portentous topic? If, in fact, we're successful at discussing the requirement for assessment processes to identify potential spoiler threats, we will increase the potential for success in our peace and stability operations. Here are two reasons why. Steve Stedman, and you may be familiar with him, he is the person who gave us the concept of spoilers in 1997. It's been that long. But he says this: the signing of a peace agreement has been sufficient to trigger international involvement to implement that agreement, but nowhere near sufficient to ensure the international commitment to do the job right. Why will proper spoiler assessment allow us to do the job right? If we make that assessment before a mandate, we can actually include in the mandate the authorities and capabilities that are required to develop a strategy to address spoilers. Point number one. Second point, this comes from Kofi Annan. You probably already heard this many times. Currently, half the countries emerging from violent conflict revert to conflict within 5 years. We all know that that's an unacceptable statistic. We can do better. How? Well, one of the things that we have in the book is that, and I think Alessandro might have mentioned this, if we in fact assess spoilers, we can seize the golden hour. And the golden hour is a medical term, but if in fact you get the patient to the hospital in an hour, their survival rate goes way up. If you don't, they die. That's the reason we have a 50% reversion to conflict, because we don't address spoiler threats in time. Proper spoiler assessment will allow us to do that. I was interested, Alessandro mentioned statistics that I have from this work. This is what we published in 2016. But I'll just reiterate the fact that 100% of UN missions, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq, have been obstructed by criminalized power structures. 70% of UN missions, just as the statistic, there have been 24 interventions by the UN since 1990, since the end of the Cold War. Not missions, but like in Haiti, there have been something like 5 missions. That counts as one intervention. So 17 of those 24 missions have been obstructed by spoilers in the form of criminalized power structures. I'm not saying there aren't any other type of spoilers. I don't know what they are, but I can say that the predominant form of spoiling comes in the form of criminalized power structures. So my focus will be on how to address that threat. Let me just, before I get into the overview here, give you a little bit of background about why I was driven to address this topic. So I worked in Bosnia, and that wasn't in the introduction. So I worked in Bosnia for S4 in 1996, and then I worked as the strategic planner for UNMIK, the UN mission in Kosovo, in 2000. And based on that experience, I was, and I'll give you one anecdote from the Bosnia experience about why I felt that criminalized power structures or this phenomenon needed to be addressed. In Bosnia, they began to call the obstructionists that they were confronting parallel power structures, similar name. And when I was there in 96, working for S4, we had interpreters, a Bosniak and a Serb, who did a tour. We had a half day off on a Sunday. So I took the tour, and it brought us to the tunnel the opening of the tunnel inside Sarajevo that went under the airport, that was their only lifeline to get food and essential supplies into Sarajevo. So they told us about a battle that they were having with the Serbs possessing the high ground from the terrain where they had the Olympics, raining artillery fire down on the Bosniaks, and they were taking casualties. They had to be evacuated. They needed medical treatment that was not available in Sarajevo, so they took them to the tunnel, and they were told, sorry, you're going to have to wait 2 hours. They're going to die. Well, the Serb mafia had rented the tunnel and was bringing in a consignment of frozen chicken to be sold by the Bosniak mafia at inflated prices, and that was my epiphany. I thought this was supposed to be an ethnic conflict. What's going on here? In fact, there were criminal motives driving that conflict and perpetuating it. And so, and I will skip the anecdote from Kosovo as well. I'll mention some of the specifics later. But the point is, was this criminalized power structure phenomenon, that's what I'm calling it now, confined to the Balkans? Is that just a regional issue? Or is it something more general? And that's why I did the book, and also to identify what strategies work. It wasn't just to identify a problem, but how to solve it. one of the solutions is proper assessment of spoilers. So this is what I'm going to talk about, the definition of criminalized power structures. And just to repeat the point, and I guess I hadn't made this point yet. So in the 10 case studies that we looked at in criminalized power structures, the overlooked enemies of peace, the average amount of time between when the mission was deployed and when they received the authorities and capabilities that were required to develop a strategy to combat spoilers was almost 5 years. You've not only squandered the golden hour, you've worn out the welcome mat after 5 years, especially if you've been inept, the international intervention, at confronting the spoiler threat. So that we can fix that with proper assessment. And I'm going to talk about the how-to question, or the so what question. How do we go about addressing the spoiler threat? We can actually develop the information needed. First of all, identify the right questions asked, but gather that information using open source methodologies, which would make it possible for international organizations to share assessment methodologies. So that's the way ahead. So what's a spoiler? I should put my work in the context of Stephen Stedman. This is how he defined spoilers, and he is the originator of the term. Leaders and parties who believe that peace emerging from negotiations threatens their power, worldview, and interests, and use violence to undermine attempts to achieve it. I emphasize the reference to violence because the UN in its Capstone Doctrine and then the Hippo report open up the possibility that non-violent actions also can constitute spoiling behavior. So that is something we may not get into that very much in this discussion, but certainly for the workshop to follow, to define what spoiling behavior means and whether nonviolent activity could constitute spoiling. Because of the reference to peace negotiations, spoilers only occur after they're spoilers of peace agreements. So that only can happen after you have a peace agreement. And there are two types, those who are inside or party to the agreement, and those who are outside and they are not party to the agreement. That's spoiler. What's a criminalized power structure? Excuse me. The central defining characteristic of a criminalized power structure is that they obtain and maintain power on the basis of their access to illicit revenue, criminally derived revenue. That's how they obtain power. That comes in two forms. One would call grand corruption, the gray market, but grand corruption or state capture. So they obtain revenue through looting of natural resources, diversion of customs revenue, rent seeking. That's one category. The other would be the black economy or organized crime. Sir? Yes, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you very much. Yeah, appreciate that. The black market, trafficking in humans, trafficking in drugs, money laundering, et cetera. Those are the two categories of illicit revenue that in different combinations could be used. The illicit revenue can be the motive, in other words, capture of the state so they members of the criminalized power structure can personally benefit, or it could be the incentive, the means by which an insurgency obtains the ability to confront a government. And of course, the reason for that is probably because the government is corrupt and predatory, and that is what's motivating them to rise up in arms. But it's either greed or grievance, and of course it's important to understand that in terms of the development of your strategy. So as implied by what I just said, criminalized power structures can both be the state or the opponent of the state. The most important point for our purposes of assessing spoilers is that they're not on any organizational chart. It's not the formal structures of power that are important. It's the informal patronage and clientele networks that we need to recognize. And it's not the formal economy, but it's the underground subterranean criminal economy that we need to capture. These are hidden networks. Our assessment methodologies need to be able to identify that, and Oscar Vera will talk about how he did that in Bosnia. Okay, so I've already mentioned the fact that there were 24 missions, 17 of which were obstructed by criminalized power structures. This is the list. I mentioned Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan are among the cases that I looked at in my own work. And so that's 100% of NATO missions that have been obstructed. The figure for the UN is about 70%, 17 out of the 24 cases. So what question? So what if we don't identify the spoiler threat before we intervene? Well, in Bosnia, Oscar Vera arrived in 98, I think it was, 2 or 3 years after Dayton. The third entity movement had not been identified as a potential spoiler threat. The third entity movement was that Herzegovina, the Croat part, would separate itself and join with Croatia. That would have left the Bosniak rump state non-viable and led directly to conflict. Not only was his assessment methodology the first one to say we have a spoiler problem, but it led to the development of a strategy that successfully dismantled the threat. So I would posit that the most effective assessment methodology should be designed to provide the information that leads to a strategy. Oscar will talk about how he did that. In Kosovo, I didn't give you the anecdote about my time there. I got there in April of 2000. But by the time I had gotten there, we did not anticipate, we, UNMIC, KFOR, et cetera, did not anticipate that the KLA, 4 minutes, would be a spoiler threat. Reverse ethnic cleansing, I'm just going to quickly look at that. They also were attacking their Kosovo Albanian opposition, the KLA, the LDK, Ibrahim Rugova. Afghanistan, you know, the corruption in the Karzai government became termed criminal patronage networks. So that opened the door for the Taliban to reemerge as a threat. And in Iran, it was Nouri al-Maliki who, after we left, vitiated, hollowed out their military through ghost soldiers, had 50,000 ghost soldiers, and politicized off support. There had been professional leaders, they were replaced by his cronies. There's a requirement, I'll just mention that the 2014 Integrated Assessment of Planning Handbook mentions that there is no agreed methodology for assessing risk to UN missions. We need to do something about that. Hopefully we'll hear that there has been progress made on that. Here are probably the most important, and I need to shut it off. But these are the things I would suggest, characteristics that we need to look at. It's not the formal power structures, it's the informal networks that we need to identify. What are the sources of illicit revenue that they depend on? And by the way, Sara, if these look familiar, I read this from your chapter, so a lot of these you mentioned as well. Are these power structures linked to organized crime, terrorist organizations, or regional clients? Outside spoilers. Are the police, the legal system, and the armed forces, and especially the intelligence apparatus, are they part of the problem or part of the solution? We really need to understand the intelligence apparatus. And what are their vulnerable nodes? And as I mentioned, open sources can be used. Oscar's methodology relies on open sources, which would make an assessment methodology shareable. Okay, I'm almost done. So here are the other so what question. Well, so if we identify that we have a spoiler threat, what do we do about it? There are 3 things that we should do at a minimum, and 2 of them are performed by stability police. Intelligence and criminal investigative capability need to be an attribute and have the resources to conduct that. A robust policing capability for things like high-risk arrest, surveillance, close protection of people who are taking the risk for peace. And finally, a hybrid court, both internationals and indigenous judges, prosecutors, and jailers. And here's your homework assignment. I've got an article that will be available that argues that NATO needs to urgently address and adopt the stability policing concept. 2 of the 3 recommendations that I just made require stability police. And finally, for extra credit, if you'll give me your business card or email address, I will send you the page proofs for criminalized power structures so that you can have that available for your own use. Okay, did I make it?
We are now working to get the questions on the screen. They will be there in a minute.
Oh, that's right.
So we would love you to answer the questions. And of course, what Michael said, if you have questions which you are not going to address through the app, feel free to ask. I don't want to read them. You can read them yourself. Would you be so kind to start with the first question and the answer on it?
Could I indicate or list any other spoilers in CPS? I can't. I haven't studied that. I just simply can't assert myself that the only type of spoilers are criminalized power structures. That's all I've studied. I don't know of any that, because I haven't looked at that. Actually, this is a really good question. I'm writing an article about. One of the things that Steve Stedman did, his purpose of his article wasn't to just define spoilers. He wanted to develop a typological theory of spoiler management. I mentioned my work was dedicated to identifying what strategies work. So in this article, I want to challenge the scholarly community to go back to his article and try to do that. But at any rate, one of the questions that I would like to ask other scholars to do, that what other types of spoilers are there? I don't know, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist.
Maybe, if I shortly may, because I also don't know, I'm not the expert, but if I may just jump in, I mean, other spoiler threats.
Yeah.
A president of a country, a political system, all spoiler threats, if I may.
But
I mean, of course, these criminal power structures, what you see coming everywhere. But
Right.
what happens when we have a corrupt president? Let's say the Netherlands has a big war and we have a corrupt king. Is he a spoiler threat? Yes, I think so. So, but I'm quite happy with the question because it means that we're thinking about what it actually is, which will help us at the end in the workshop and furthermore
Right.
to think about the future, how to work with it. So I don't want to know who asked the question, but thanks for it.
And thank you. I would challenge the rest of you, to suggest what other types there might be. And, oh, good, so we can take questions here. Oh, good.
Good morning, and thanks for a very interesting presentation on these criminals' political structure. I'd just like to throw out one potential other type of spoiler then that we have in some other context, not so much mine. They're called the idealists. And some of them are ready to blow themselves up for something they believe in and coming to heaven and 40 virgins and all that. Just something to add perhaps to the equation.
Thanks, Andrew.
Shall I read the... According to you, should be the nonviolent actors considered as spoilers? Oh, yeah, okay, so should we consider nonviolent actors as well as violent actors? And I totally agree with that. A lot of the spoiling behavior that criminalized power structures engage in is nonviolent. Example, in Bosnia, and I don't know if Oscar's going to get into this, but one of the things that the third entity movement did, which the network involved both the Croatian intelligence service and the Herzegovina intelligence service, and guess what? They spied on the international community, including their investigations into human rights violations, but beyond that, suborning members of the local staff who became informants. So they were spying on us. That's not violence, but it sure is hostile. And the other thing that I consider to be nonviolent spoiling, there's several things. One would be grand theft. In Afghanistan, the Kabul bank theft was like equal to 5 to 7% of the GNP of Afghanistan. Karzai and his cronies spirited the money out. And I think eventually a little bit was recaptured. James Cunningham would be able to fill us in. But, that deprived us, the international community and Afghanistan, of the resources that were required to try to reconstruct and stabilize the state. In addition, the fact of such corruption delegitimizes not only government, but our association with the government, because we didn't do anything about it. So we're seen to be part of this criminalized or illicit cabal. Impunity is another. The fact that the legal system cannot and will not find any of the members of the criminalized power structure guilty of crimes against the mandate. That's another, nonviolent, but critically debilitating threat. So those are just some examples of nonviolent threats. So thank you for the question. Do you feel the need to improve or to update the current definitions or approaches regarding the spoilers? Well, yeah, that's why we're here. That's a very good point. Somebody had that. So we need to work together to develop. I think what we need to do is canvass what's out there. Are there any assessment methodologies available to us? We're going to hear about one, but we need to look and see what else is out there, and then work together to be able to identify spoilers. But then the second part of that question is, what do we do about them? Just mention, do you feel the need to improve or update current definitions or approaches? Okay, so the approaches part of this is, what do we do once we identify that the police force, the legal system, and the overall regime are part of the problem? We don't build their capacity. That's not the solution. How do we rectify that in a sovereign state with one of the parties to the peace agreement? Sounds like it's impossible to do. Oscar actually did that in Bosnia to some success. Obviously, Bosnia is not a success story, but he was able to take down the third entity movement, working with people he could trust. So there's a lot that we need to learn about, and that's where the NATO Stability Police Center of Excellence is well positioned to support that. And by the way, if you're interested in that point, it's in the article that's forthcoming in Military Spectator, what I just said. So I've written down both what's needed and the role of the Center of Excellence in pursuing that. So have we exhausted the questions?
Not yet. I will come to you in a second. Thank you already. What we see is that several questions pop up. We will not put them on the screen anymore. However, we would love you to keep asking the questions because we're going to use them in the workshop. However, we still have some time to go, and for sure there is one more question. I would like to give you the microphone. Thank you already.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, Michael. Good morning, everyone. I'm the Gimenez from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe.
Thank you.
So you stated in one of your slides that spoilers exist only after peace agreement.
Right.
I would argue with this point. First, because the example that you provide us demonstrates the opposite. Regarding the tunnel under the runway in Sarajevo between England Mount and the town, it was before the peace agreement.
Right.
So this story could demonstrate the opposite, that in fact spoiler exists before the peace agreement. And would you agree?
Well, finish your question.
Yes, please.
Okay. That is not my definition. That's Steve Stedman's definition. So now, the point you're making, though, yes, I talked about activity that took place before the Dayton Agreement. And the point is that just because you have a peace agreement doesn't mean that those networks will magically disappear. That's the way the place runs. So a peace agreement, you know, so they're not going to, well, I won't say not, but the likelihood is that those activities are going to be perpetuated. And to the extent that the peace agreement is trying to promote the rule of law, that's not compatible with the interests of these networks. So Stedman's definition says you only have spoiling after a peace agreement. However, the spoiler networks predate the peace agreement, and they're not going to disappear just because you have a piece of paper that says, now we're going to change things. So that's the challenge. What strategies will work? I could get into that. That's a separate discussion, you know. I need to get you a copy of the book. Give me your card so we can continue this dialogue. Are we out of time? Or time for
I'm afraid so. I would love to react, not in giving an answer, but on the last question. The question actually is, do spoilers threats not exist even before we plan an operation? Should we not take into consideration spoiler threats, identify them before an operation? For sure, these questions will raise this day or will be, let's say, addressed. And for sure, there will be in the conclusions of this day in order to go on the workshop and furthermore with the 4 organizations. If I may, Sara, I would like to introduce you, which is going to be hard. And not because you're going to be hard to introduce, but as far as I can see it in a summary of a CV, interesting,
Raggedy.
Live, raggedy, really.
Raggedy.
It strikes me. Could take hours, guys. I mean, I could tell about, well, I think I could if I look well enough, but I won't do it. Quite an unusual period, which led from your reporting to the National Public Radio in Paris to running a soap factory in downtown Kandahar, where you lived and worked. Interesting. You served as a special advisor to 2 commanders of international forces in Afghanistan and the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff in the US. I hope you were critical. I think so. And then your work uncovered the unrecognized reality that severe and structured corruption lies as the root of many international crises. You are the author of the LA Times Book Prize winner Thieves of State, Why Corruption Threatens Global Security, and a forthcoming work on corruption in the United States. Love to give you the floor.
Thank you.
Looking forward.
I have to say I am awestruck at how far this conversation has come in the last 5 years. I expected to have to say a number of things that 5 years ago would have been, I have some victims in the audience here, that would have been disruptive, and now I find I'm just repeating what has already been said. I've also been billed as speaking about Afghanistan, and that's a lie. I'm not going to speak about Afghanistan. I've done enough of that. Again, some of you are victims. And there's other very qualified people to do that. And also, I just want to draw attention to Michael's bullet point that said something on the order of the, behavior of the criminal patronage networks in Afghanistan pushed people into the arms of the Taliban or allowed the resurgence of the Taliban. That simple sentence, which you just put up there as a bullet point as a matter of fact, I mean, just having that reality accepted as a description of what happened in Afghanistan is such a gigantic change from, 5 or 10 years ago that again, whether we can act on these new formulations is the next question, because it gets very political. And the idea that stability work is somehow apolitical when you're in environments like this is a fantasy. And that means it's not just us on the ground that need to address these in operational Venn diagrams like Oscars, but it means we need our chiefs of state to stand behind us, because these networks go directly up to the chief of state locally, which means we need our capitals behind us, and that we usually fail to have. So I'll be talking about very similar issues, but using somewhat different vocabulary and somewhat different shapes on the pictures. So I'd like to talk about corruption, so it's not so much the spoilers, but the spoils. And too often in peace agreements, what we actually have is a division of the spoils. And the way that we get the warring parties to sit down at the table and sign a piece of paper is we implicitly say, okay, you're going to divide up the spoils. Therefore, in fact, it's the parties to the agreement themselves who may be within a year or two, the primary spoilers. And that's a really hard boundary, I think, often for us interveners in our minds to cross. So just a few words on corruption. Not part of anyone's culture. I don't know how often I've been asked, but isn't that just part of the culture in South Asia or in the Balkans or whatever? No, I've only heard that question from Westerners. I don't know any Nigerian or any Serb or any Afghan or any Tunisian who has ever said, you know what, Sarah, get off your corruption shtick. We really don't mind it. It's just part of our culture. That has never, nobody likes being robbed by their government. So let's dispense with that. Corruption is not victimless. Not only is petty corruption, you know, you're face to face with an officer of the law whose job is to protect you from criminals and to uphold the law, and he is breaking the law. You are his victim. And you are being robbed not only of your money, you're being robbed of your dignity. And I could give you, you know, examples where a young Afghan man gets smacked in the face, a friend of mine, because he wouldn't pay the bribe. You know, you're a 23-year-old Afghan man, you just got smacked in the face by a police officer, and you've got Taliban all around. How many times does that have to happen before you decide, I'm going to join the Taliban, I'm going to shoot the fucker? Excuse me. You know, it's not just about money, that's what I mean. He may have only been robbed of a couple of equivalent euros, but being smacked in the face is very weighty. And so all of these efforts to quantify the spoils and quantify corruption are missing this dynamic. And I have to say, I had this conversation in Nigeria with officers of the law, meaning police, in particular prosecutors, in particular the lawyer side, not the police side. And at some point, a prosecutor said, Sarah, you've only been talking about money. It's not just about money. And I said, oh, really? And he said, and I'm shocked that I didn't think of this. He said, and he starts to tell me the story of the woman whose husband was in preventive detention, who was diabetic, and she said, it's a bailable offense, let me take him home, I promise I'll deliver him to court, I need to give him his medicine. And the judge took advantage of her. It's called sextortion, it's rampant, and not just in developing countries, as we are all coming increasingly to know these days. And as a female, obviously, it infuriates me. As a security professional, I'm thinking about her brother. What does he want to do? He wants to shoot the judge. And if he lives in Maiduguri, in northern Nigeria, he's got ample opportunity to join more obvious types of spoilers and shoot the judge. We're going to get to isolated individuals in next, and meaning. Corruption too often is seen as the work of individual venal officials or of these external groups, organized crime, or, you know, again, this is where I differ a little bit with Michael, where the presumption is it's the informal. The presumption is it's outside the power structure. But we're going to see kind of how I visualize this, which is slightly different. And as I said before, often the spoils of peace agreements. So I'm not talking about Afghanistan. I'm going to show you Honduras. This is sort of what I want to get at. This knot in the middle, so my colors are different. I have blue for government, green for so-called private sector, and red for the criminal sector. If you were to do this on Afghanistan, I would probably include a black ring, which would be the Taliban, because they are interwoven into this thing. These are sophisticated, integrated criminal networks. They're vertically integrated, meaning the police who are part of them, who are shaking down my cooperative member or my friend, you know, and smacking him in the face, they're paying part of their spoils up the line, right? So our allies are the spoilers, and our way of allying with them is often also part of the spoiling, because as we are enabling and reinforcing them, if we don't look at this type of behavior, we are making it easier for them to then prey upon their own populations. And as I say, the spoils go up the line all the way to the interior minister. But here I'm looking more at the horizontal integration of the networks, meaning public sector, private sector, criminal sector, intimately interwoven. So even with Oscar, I would say sometimes that interweaving is through exchanges, but sometimes it's because they're literally part of the same network, because the cousin is the chief of police, and the other cousin is the head of the drug gang, and the father-in-law is the provincial governor, right? So you're actually woven together in kinship relationships or very deep tissue of professional relationships. And as Aaron pointed out, I've just finished a book, it's not out yet, on the United States, and I can just briefly, who has heard of this story of Jeffrey Epstein and the young girls, right? Like everyone, right? And the US attorney who let him off rather lightly in 2008. Well, it turns out that opposite the US attorney, the defense attorneys were part of that US attorney's network. And I had actually discovered this before last year, before Epstein ever came out. I had discovered that, oh my God, they went to school together, they were in the same law firm together, they worked together under the same judges as, so they're sitting opposite the table each other. Whoops, did I just do that? Sorry. Whoops. Sorry. Getting too enthusiastic. As usual, I'm in Italy, right? I'm allowed. So these networks are in all of our societies. They're not just the WOGs who have these networks. What I mean by the arrows is that external money, sorry, I used a US figure, not a, that's all, I mean, think about the Balkans, think about, I mean, the Balkans obviously, think about Afghanistan, think about Iraq, the amount of, the revenue stream pouring into these countries from us is gigantic. And it gets captured by this network, right? So that's the feedback loop there. And a lot of it goes back out to Dubai or to, you know, Miami or to Palm Beach or to the Virgin Islands, right? And what happens down here? Sorry, I'm a little not the greatest PowerPoint jockey. Somebody else did the beautiful picture. People get pissed off, and then they join what we consider more traditionally to be spoilers, meaning the Taliban or the third, what's it called?
Third entity.
Third entity, right. So I don't want to drag you into the details of Honduras, but I want to just walk you through a couple. So this is a slightly alternative analysis method, right? And you guys in your workshops are going to figure out what pictures work the best for you or what analytical frameworks work the best for you. Public sector, the blue. The power of the pen. You always want to own it somehow. You either own the Congress or you disable it. And it's pretty interesting to look at the United States Congress right now and how incredibly disabled it is. It can't vote. That's deliberate because it's the most democratic entity of government. And it has been completely kneecapped. All right, here we're getting into policing because the rule of law function is absolutely critical to be owned by kleptocratic networks. And that means because part of the vertical integration is in return for the money going upwards, you have a guarantee of impunity going downwards. And this is what I really discovered in Afghanistan as we started trying to work these cases in 2008, 9, like that. And we couldn't quite understand why Karzai was so deliberately sabotaging these cases. And it wasn't until we understood that it's not quite patronage, or it's not exclusively patronage, because patronage is the spoils going downwards. In this case, it was very clearly spoils going upwards, up the system, and what was going downwards was impunity. So for impunity, you have to own the justice function. Or if you don't own it, you figure out a workaround. So President Sisi in Egypt, for example, can't quite control the judiciary, the civilian judiciary. So what did he do? He legislated the jurisdiction. He changed the jurisdiction of the courts so that the military courts were taking a much greater bulk of cases, and he could control the military courts. Bingo. Always the police are playing a role. They're either a revenue collection mechanism, or sometimes they are the formal instrument of force used by a kleptocratic network. So in Egypt, again, for example, what you had under Mubarak briefly was two competing kleptocratic networks. One was the military one, and one was a new civilian one gathered around Gamal Mubarak. He used Amana Shurta, which was a particular police unit. That was his formal instrument of force. Those two networks clashed. The military took advantage of the public disaffection with Gamal and then wiped out the public. And now the military kleptocratic network is in sole power in Egypt. But the police were very important to Gamal Mubarak. And so this is where stability policing becomes incredibly difficult, because the police is often the or a key instrument of the spoiler who is the government. And our support for the police, if we don't pay attention to this, actually exacerbates the problem. Prisons, similarly, armed forces, it depends. Again, in Afghanistan, frequently the police were picked on as being, you know, the bad guys, and the army was supposedly clean. As soon as the army got close to the population, it started shaking them down too, obviously. All right, just briefly, because at least we Americans love to argue over who's worse for your health, the public sector or the private sector. In fact, in these networks, they are intimately intertwined. There are three that I have seen come up in every single kleptocratic network that I have studied, and they are the financial sector, the energy sector, and the high-end luxury real estate and public works sector. That's revenue streams, and the network captures them. And again, I just leave that in front of you. I don't want to focus too much on the United States, but it's kind of interesting, those three sectors. What else do we have? This is an interesting one, which I also discovered in Afghanistan first. The so-called nonprofit sector, which becomes intertwined into these networks. In Afghanistan, I kept being told, well, why aren't you getting any projects when I got there? What that meant was, why aren't you getting, like, road building projects? I'm like, I don't know how to build, I'm not an engineer, I don't know how to build a road. But no, I was a, quote, NGO, therefore I was supposed to, quote, get a contract and put the money in my pocket. Then someone, anyway. So then you get things like the Fund Forum in Uzbekistan, which belonged to Karimov's daughter. You get what was called the 25-25, 25-25, I think, in Tunisia, which belonged to to Trabelsi. And you have, you know, things like the Clinton Foundation or the Trump Foundation or what have you. This is an important potential spoiler in these networks, especially, again, when they belong to the power group, to the power structures. All right, criminal elements. So this, again, is where my experience is slightly different from some others, but I would argue that too often the narcotics traffickers are actually woven into the kleptocratic network. So again, those of us who work on organized crime like to think about the organized criminals as the star of the movie, and the corrupt government officials, the corrupt, customs, right? Customs agents who let them across the border as the supporting actors. And what I've seen too often is, in fact, the drug smugglers and the customs agents are cousins, or the president, it's the son of the president is the drug smuggler, and of course the customs officials work directly for this network. I suspected this in Honduras. I wasn't able to document it, but I'm pretty sure that was part of it. That's another obvious one that kicks up. You need people who can cross borders as part of your as part of your integrated network, right? The problem, whoops. Let me do this again. This is really important. So as, again, North Americans, we hear about all of these migrants coming up from Central America, who are fleeing violence at the hands of armed groups. And that's how it is framed in most treatments of the topic. It took me about 2 days in Honduras to figure out, of course, the police are outsourcing their extortion to the gangs. The gangs are part of the kleptocratic network, because the police don't have to stand on the side of the road like they did in Afghanistan to shake people down. They get the gangs to do their shaking down for them. And that, you don't quite hear that as often. And it's plausibly deniable, and the permission can be revoked. You can then, on a whim, decide, okay, now you're going to crack down on this gang. But that doesn't mean that it's not sort of also part of the network. What's poor about this picture is it suggests that it's contained within Honduras. This is my pathetic effort to show that these networks are intimately transnational. And ideally, I would have opened this Celtic knot and had the big strands reaching across the Honduran borders. But the point is, once you're into organized crime, you're into transnational, and anyone who's worked in the Balkans, right? I mean, all these networks are profoundly, you can think of it as a airplane, airline route map with with the hubs in different cities, and then the arcing lines. So you'll have a little network basically located in a hub, but it has arcing lines leading to other ones. All right, this is where we get into our role participating in the spoiling, which we like to think that we don't do. These are the obvious ones, right? The external service providers that we started talking about, like banks, like real estate agents, like lobbying firms, like, the people who for a fee provide services to these networks, and they're rife. Then we have the enablers. And this is where we, interveners, are in a very uncomfortable position. To what extent is our security assistance in the way that it's provided actually enabling the spoilers within the system rather than curbing them? Development assistance likewise. I would also say even our efforts to curb the spoilers, if they are not wholehearted enough, are counterproductive. So I saw this in Afghanistan a lot, where, for example, $1 billion is stolen out of Kabul Bank, and do you know where the governor of the central bank is now? He is running a 2-bit insurance agency someplace in Virginia because he had to flee Afghanistan because when we found this out, the United States did not back him up. And this happened all over the place. The incredibly courageous, I want to say, anti-corruption investigators and prosecutors that we paid for and we trained and we mentored, the US, in particular UK also was a very key player in this, and kind of wound them up and shoved them into the fight. when it got hot, we disappeared. We disappeared, and they got sent to Siberia. And in Siberia and Afghanistan, what that meant was RC East out into Paktika province, where they were going to get their heads shot off. I mean, I remember the UK was paying top-up salaries for these prosecutors, meaning they made the equivalent of $800 a month. Their regular salary was $2. When this started to get hot, Karzai told the UK, it's an invasion of our sovereignty for you to be paying salaries to these guys. There must be other UK, I'm picking on him because he's wearing the uniform, so you know. And the salary suddenly went back down to $200. I mean, you're going to take on the senior political figures in a country on a $200 salary and you're walking to work? Forget it. And at some point when US folks were saying to, I think it was a Deputy Attorney General, go ahead and work this case, he says, yeah, and when Karzai goes after me, what are you going to do? And the answer was nothing. So we have to be really careful if we do want to take on this type of spoiler, and it needs, as I say, to go all the way up to our chiefs of state, because these networks are vertically integrated, and they're going to go up to the chief of state locally. What else do I have? Not important. Some of these are when you invite people to stature enhancing. So let me finish up with this. There's some other stuff that we can talk about, but in terms of, just to sort of add to Oscar's methodology, how many of you have done link analysis? A couple. I would urge link analysis to add to some of this work to look at who is who in the zoo, but expand your link analysis beyond the external people and include key politicians, key business people. Really cross the borders with your link analysis. And the last thing I would say in terms of instruments that we have, the legal stuff that Oscar did, bless you, and bless you that you had that mandate. In Afghanistan, we did not. But there's a whole panoply of other things you can do, because a legal system, even at the best of times, is going to be a very constrained instrument that you have. You can't work very many legal cases. But you can, for example, subject people to search when they come on the base. You can not invite them to fancy meetings. You can hold back some of the perks. You can decide not to invite them. You know, you can start expanding your palette of ways of interacting with these structures that are short of legal proceedings, because those are very hard to get underway and to complete. Thank you very much.
Glasses, 58 years old. Sara, you talked about, not about spoiler threat, but spoils. And thanks for the real practices or the examples you gave, which were not out of the book, but you saw. It makes it, let's say, more knowledgeable. I'm a little bit, I don't know how it is with you, I'm a little bit, let's say, out of position. I'm inspired, I'm motivated. I also don't know where to begin. It is so in each other. And at the same time, I was looking at this, trying to understand it. I was also thinking of the presentation of Oscar, the need of thorough analysis, getting all parties together to look to all these structures. It makes it clear. I was also hearing what you said in the beginning. Didn't we talk about this 5 years ago? How long do we have to keep talking about this before we learn? I mean, that's actually what you said.
But we've at least talking about it differently now?
Yes, maybe that's the learning path. I'd love mankind to learn faster, but okay, it is what it is. Thank you so much. I think you guys are quite busy with the questions. Going to be interesting. Okay. Jean, if I may, shortly. Jean Aloise from the Office of the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan, Reconstruction, and he is their Deputy Inspector General. overseeing day-to-day operations and focusing in executing SIGAR's mission. Jean came to SIGAR from the Government Accountability Office, where he was responsible for developing, leading, and managing domestic and international works. He has testified before Congress over 50 times and was responsible for hundreds of reports with recommendations that led to legislative improvements, improve agency effectiveness and efficiency, and identified more than 8 billion in saving to taxpayers. I would, to be very honest, be quite interested to have a talk with you, my wife, and especially my kids, because there's also something to win in my family for that. May I please invite you?
Every time I'm asked to speak at one of these organizations, either NATO or some other, I always ask myself, where does SIGAR fit in our experience in Afghanistan? And basically, it's a prime example of how not to spend $132 billion. My agency, SIGAR, was created by the Congress in 2008 to oversee all U.S. reconstruction spending in Afghanistan. Even though we are a temporary agency, it's our job of nearly 200 auditors, investigators, inspectors, and other experts to ensure that that $132 billion was protected from waste, fraud, and abuse. There are numerous spoiler threats to stability, policing, and the rule of law in Afghanistan, but the greatest one, of course, is corruption. Corruption exists throughout Afghanistan and poses a significant threat to that country. Afghanistan continues to be one of the most corrupt countries in the world. In the Asia Foundation's 2018 survey of the Afghan people, 71% of Afghans said that corruption is a major problem in their daily life. And Transparency International ranks Afghanistan 172 out of 180 countries for corruption. None other than General John Allen, the former NATO and U.S. commander in Afghanistan, testified to the U.S. Congress that the existential threat to the Afghan state is corruption, not the Taliban. Unfortunately, the U.S. government failed to fully appreciate the threat of corruption for the majority of the first decade of the reconstruction effort in Afghanistan after 9/11. Not only did policymakers not understand or appreciate the scope of the problem, U.S. policy actually exacerbated corruption within the Afghan government, security forces, and non-state militias. Corruption continues to undermine the legitimacy and viability of the Afghan state, fuel grievances that strengthen the insurgency, and sap resources from the reconstruction effort. In SIGAR's Lessons Learned report, Corruption and Conflict, Lessons from the U.S. Experience in Afghanistan, one of our main findings was that the U.S. government was slow to recognize the magnitude of corruption plaguing Afghanistan and contributed to corrupt patronage networks throughout the financial and political support of Afghan warlords and strongmen. Following 9/11, the U.S. response was focused on defeating al-Qaeda, with the belief that it could be done with a relatively light U.S. military and civilian presence on the ground in Afghanistan. The U.S. military partnered with local and regional Afghan strongmen that commanded private militias, channeling money, food, ammunition, and other means of support to their men. This empowered corrupt warlords who leveraged U.S. support into positions in the newly established Afghan government. However, even when the U.S. eventually came to recognize corruption as a strategic threat, political and security goals continued to trump anti-corruption efforts. Therefore, when the U.S. started to combat corruption, those efforts were met with limited success because of the lack of political will, both by U.S. policymakers and the Afghan government. One way the U.S. has tried to combat corruption is through conditions-based funding. Now, conditions-based funding means that the U.S. lays out requirements that need to be met by the Afghan government in order for them to receive U.S. funding. However, conditionality has been a relatively recent anti-corruption effort since, according to the Combined Security Transition Command of Afghanistan, or SISTICA, which oversees the international effort to train, advise, and assist the Afghan security forces, the U.S. only began imposing conditions on the funds that to flow to the Afghan Ministries of Defense and Interior in 2014. By this time, the U.S. had been in Afghanistan for 13 years, and there had been plenty of money flowing through the Afghan ministries and into the Afghan security forces with little, if any, oversight or accountability. In fact, by December 31st, 2013, before the U.S. government started using conditionality as a tool to combat corruption, the United States had already dispersed over $45 billion to the Afghan military and police at a time when Afghanistan's average annual GDP was around $11 billion. That is $45 billion going to a government without the capacity to handle such a large infusion of money. And the money was in the coffers of two of the most corrupt government ministries in one of the most corrupt governments in the world. Since 2014, the conditions-based provision of funds and resources is determined annually by CSTICA and the Afghan National Security and Defense Forces through bilateral financial agreements or commitment letters, which set out requirements for the Ministries of Defense and Interior and the amount of funding that is tied to meet those requirements. But the rigor of enforcement on these conditions by CSTICA is questionable because, unsurprisingly, there is internal pressure to ensure the Afghan forces do not fail on the battlefield, which often makes promises to withhold money for unmet conditions just empty threats. Now, within the past few months, senior U.S. military officials have determined that conditionality is not an effective mechanism because we now have reliable partners in the ANDSF. Of course, this causes SIGAR great concern, and we are planning an audit to determine how well conditionality has been applied in the past. As distressing as high-level corruption in Afghanistan is to the international donor community, it is corruption at the local level that erodes the confidence of the average Afghan citizen the most, particularly corrupt activities undertaken by the Afghan National Police. In the Asian Foundation survey that I mentioned earlier, 39% of Afghans said that in the last 12 months, they had to give money, a gift, or a favor to the Afghan National Police. At least a third of those surveyed admitted that they had been extorted by the same people who are given the responsibility for upholding the rule of law. Corruption within the Afghan National Police is exacerbated by the flourishing illicit drug economy. In a report from the United States Institute of Peace, they note that Afghans believe almost universally that Interior Ministry officials, provincial police chief, and members of the ANP are involved in the drug trade. Given the pervasiveness of corruption in Afghanistan, unsurprisingly, much of SIGAR's work has focused on countering and combating it. SIGAR's mission to protect the $132 billion U.S. investment in the Afghan reconstruction effort from waste, fraud, and abuse means that we frequently encounter problems with corruption in our work. In our over 500 audits, inspections, and other reports, as well as in our over 1,000 criminal investigations, we have found one thing to be almost universally true. The U.S. and other partner nations pumped in too much money, too fast, in too small of an economy with too little accountability, creating an ideal environment for corruption to flourish and allowing criminals to act with impunity. Concern about corruption in Afghanistan has become so significant that the United States Congress has directed SIGAR to complete annual assessments of the Afghan government's implementation of the anti-corruption strategy it outlined at the Brussels conference in 2016. Our first assessment was issued in June 2018, and our second one should be completed shortly. And I've been in this business a long time, and I've never seen the U.S. Congress ask an agency to evaluate a sovereign government, but they did, and we were successful in doing it. Our first assessment found that the Afghan government has been meeting some of their anti-corruption benchmarks it agreed to in Brussels, but there were still major weaknesses in the government's implementation. One of the most glaring weaknesses was that the anti-corruption institutions like the Anti-Corruption Justice Center and Major Crimes Task Force were severely under-resourced and did not have the capacity to perform core functions. We also found that in cases of corruption involving powerful individuals in Afghanistan, there have been multiple incidents where the police didn't make an arrest or the Attorney General did not file charges. There have also been instances where suspects have been released prior to trial and restrictions on leaving the country were not enforced. So while the Afghan government has begun to meet some of its anti-corruption commitments, there are still fundamental problems with the implementation and a severe lack of political will. Simply meeting benchmarks does not necessarily mean that the Afghan government is seeking a corresponding reduction in corrupt activities. Often the Afghan government's work to meet anti-corruption commitments stops once a benchmark has been met, and there is no follow-through to achieve long-lasting reforms. While the Afghan justice system's commitment to countering corruption is questionable, SIGAR has had significant success in uncovering and combating corrupt activities. With the largest U.S. government oversight and law enforcement presence in Afghanistan and a robust public outreach program, our agency has become a trusted outlet for Afghans to report allegations of corruption. For example, in 2014, shortly after President Ghani and Chief Executive Abdullah assumed office, we discovered that 4 companies bidding on a nearly $1 billion Ministry of Defense fuel contract paid for by the U.S. taxpayers had colluded to rig their bids and fix their prices. SIGAR was the only agency, U.S. or Afghan, that followed up on the complaint, and when we examined the bids, we found that 4 of the submitted proposals all matched. Not only did they match to the 4th decimal place. The odds of the numbers matching so closely by pure coincidence were estimated to have been 1 in 1 trillion. We also found out that one of the firms that refused to collude with the others was approached by a member of the Afghan parliament and offered a bribe to not submit their lower bid. And when that failed, was offered another significant bribe to not report the collusion by other bidders to the Afghan Ministry of Finance. When we briefed President Ghani on our findings from the investigation, he immediately canceled the contract, which subsequently was rebid, and has saved the U.S. taxpayer over $200 million. Now, SIGAR is uniquely positioned to look at U.S. efforts to combat corruption in Afghanistan because we take a whole-of-government jurisdiction over the U.S. Reconstruction effort. So we can look into any U.S. government agency's contribution to the Reconstruction effort, as well as look more broadly at how the U.S. government agencies worked or didn't work together to achieve their goals. As I mentioned earlier, our Lessons Learned report, Corruption and Conflict, looked at how the U.S. government understood and responded to the risk of corruption in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2014. That report was one of the first government reports examining how multiple government agencies attempted to address Afghanistan's corruption challenges. Another SIGAR Lessons Learned report looked at how the U.S. utilized security sector assistance to build, train, advise, and equip the Afghan military and police. In that report, Afghan corruption is highlighted as one of the main cross-cutting issues that has inhibited the development of the Afghan security forces. We found that corruption has severely undermined the security forces' readiness and capabilities. One of the more perversive forms of corruption is the issue of ghosts, which occurs when the payroll process is manipulated to allow soldiers, police, teachers, and others on the government payroll that have been killed, fired, resigned, or just never existed in the first place to continue being paid. These salary payments are then diverted to various bank accounts that are withdrawn and shared among conspiring corrupt government and military officials. In one of our audits from 2015, we found that more than $300 million in U.S.-funded salary payments for the Afghan National Police was based on only partially verified data that there was an actual police officer on the active roster receiving the salary the U.S. was paying. As a result, there could be thousands of paychecks each month designated for someone who is either no longer on the job or doesn't exist allowing more corrupt officials to collect multiple paychecks. Since that 2015 audit, the U.S. Department of Defense has taken steps to cull the number of ghost payroll accounts in the Afghan security forces by putting additional safeguards like biometric enrollment for Afghan police and soldiers into place. But the ghost problem still exists. Even with the new safeguards, the sticker reported that only 69% of ANDP personnel were enrolled in the new, more reliable system as of February of this year, leaving a significant number of the force still vulnerable to payroll fraud. Information available to SIGAR indicates that the ghost accounts probably still number in the thousands. This is a direct threat to the U.S. investment in the Afghan police, but also to the integrity of the UN's trust fund, which pays the salaries of police in Afghanistan. International donors have contributed nearly $5.6 billion to LAFTA since 2002. Ghost police and soldiers pose more than just a financial threat. The diversion of money into the pockets of corrupt officers deprives the Afghan security forces of critical funding that could be used to properly train, equip, and staff a capable force, a task that has already proven difficult for the international community to accomplish. In a lessons learned report issued by SIGAR earlier this year, SIGAR found that the U.S. and its NATO partners have not agreed on whether developing Afghan police capabilities is primarily a civilian or a military responsibility. For example, in the U.S. civilian agencies like the Departments of State and Justice, although they have the legal authority to undertake the development of foreign police forces, they do not have the resources to deploy experts in a high-threat environment like Afghanistan. Conversely, the U.S. military does have the required authorities, funding, and resources to develop foreign police forces, but the military, of course, can operate in high-threat environments and therefore will normally be assigned the task regardless if it has the capacity or capability to do so. The result is the U.S. deployed untrained and unprepared military officials, such as Army helicopter pilots, and we have one in the audience, right, Zach? To train Afghan police. We brought a prop. This tension between civilians and the military on who leads police development is an issue in other NATO countries as well. For example, Germany, like the U.S., sees police development as a mission for civilian organizations. Other countries, including Italy, Romania, and France, recognize the unique strength of the gendarme forces, military units trained in civilian policing. This disconnect amongst NATO countries has led to duplicative and disjointed efforts by multiple countries, institutions, and non-governmental organizations in Afghanistan to develop a robust Afghan civilian police capability. For example, in 2007, the European Union Police Mission in Afghanistan, or EUPOL, deployed police experts to develop Afghan Ministry of Interior personnel and senior leaders of the Afghan National Police. But the EUPOL training efforts did not coordinate with other police training efforts already being conducted by other NATO partners, complicating the development of a unified national police force. While working groups were created to deconflict activities, the mission suffered from the lack of a shared vision for the Afghan police forces, resulted in a disjointed and unsuccessful effort. All of this has created an identity crisis within the Afghan police force. Are the police a paramilitary force aimed at countering the Taliban-led insurgency, or should police forces focus on community policing? The lack of a shared vision for the Afghan police by various NATO partners and other organizations has led to too often contradictory training and support for Afghan police forces. The lack of coordination is inhibiting the development of a civil police force, which is one of the most important elements for ensuring long-term stability in Afghanistan. As hopes for a peaceful settlement to the conflict in Afghanistan persists, all parties need to think about how the Afghan police might function in a potential post-peace environment. The Afghan National Police are the most visible link between the Afghan government and local communities. If the NATO coalition is unable to develop these forces as neutral arbiters of justice and corruption within the ranks is not addressed, then the cycle of distrust between the Afghan government and the people it governs will continue. Now, obviously, the Afghan police forces, much like the rest of the Afghan government, continue to face severe challenges. But I would like to applaud you all, and specifically the NATO Centers for Excellence, for continuing these conversations to improve processes for building a civil police force. We at SIGAR are encouraged by the willingness to engage in a frank conversation on the need to combat corruption in Afghanistan, particularly in the context of building the Afghan National Police. And I would also like to thank the NATO Stability Policing Center of Excellence for engaging with SIGAR on best practices for developing civil police forces in Afghanistan. And we look forward to continue working with you as we finalize other reports on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gene. The story of corruption in Afghanistan. As you said, over 70% is complaining about corruption. And directly, we also think about the presentation of Sara, which says it's not in culture. More people are complaining on corruption than they are complaining about Taliban. It hurts people. You talked about corruption. It's a spoiler threat. It's a spoiler. Do we need to deal with it first? Do we need to deal with it while we're in the mission? All questions. You also talked that, let's say, in the beginning of the mission, when we just started over there, we did not recognize enough the level of corruption in Afghanistan. And later on, we understood what was happening. At least we understood more what was happening. And that time, we found out there were over 500 reports, 1,000 investigations, researches, too much money, too fast in a too small economy in which criminals get their positions. Again, a lot of things happening in Afghanistan, but this is, let's say, one of the things we were talking about. A lot of things we need to learn, a lot of things we need to use in order to understand what we're doing and how we can conquer the future. Gene, thank you very much. The last part, before we have the lunch, we have too many questions. And these are not all the questions. We put on the questions, and the numbers before the questions are, let's say, voted by you, and we put them, let's say, the most wanted questions first. We will do these 6 questions, and if wanted and we have time, we might do some more. And looking at the first one, do you recommend, and you might be one of the 3 of you, do you recommend a shared methodology amongst the main international organizations intended to assess the spoiler threats, which is, of course, also a little bit which this conference is all about? But who would like to give his or her opinion on this question?
I'm of 2 minds, so it's not a very good answer. On the one hand, I think that these networks, there certainly are common principles. But for example, I mean, just sort of riffing on the question, I spent some time in Nepal, and an organization there sort of took my picture and ran with it with the same principles, but ended up with another entity that existed in Nepal. And so what I would say is, on some level, yes, because if international organizations are working together in a theater, it's good for them to have a common framework for assessing these threats. Agree 100% with Oscar that it needs to be what might be called a fusion cell. I mean, you need to have working on this assessment the separate expertises that are available to customs folks, to criminal investigators, to social scientists, to anthropologists even, to military intelligence people. You want them working together to provide the assessment with the understanding that the framework ought to be flexible enough to allow for slightly different configurations of these networks in different countries and different types, different revenue streams. What my drawing didn't show, except very schematically, was what are the sources of revenue, external and internal, and where is the money going. It also didn't actually show a genuine link analysis, which you would probably want to do with the actual people, and you could then color them with the different colors. You also want to see, which my diagram didn't show, does the public sector seem to be in the lead? In some countries, Azerbaijan, the public sector is in the lead. In Moldova, the private sector is very much in the lead. The stripe would be fatter, you know. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you have a common methodology, beware of too much rigidity. It needs to be flexible enough to adapt to the configuration in the specific theater.
If I might try to refrain a little bit, you are saying yes, because this could be a mean for international organizations to work together, or even more together than they already do. However, your thought is, and you didn't say it, but I love the international organization, but they can be very rigid. And when they start working together, it can be more rigid because they make a tool which is sometimes also a political solution, because every organization wants to see something back of what they thought of, and then don't stay only within that tool, but find the flexibility. Is that correct? So I reframe that as a big yes, do it, but be aware.
The only thing I would add is from Cigar's point of view, and we can apply this to everything, is as we face these new situations, do we learn from prior experience? Do we have a lessons learned ingrained into this formula somewhere? Because we didn't learn it in Afghanistan, and I'm not sure we're going to learn it in the next.
Okay, not to, let's say, push the question away, but I would like to at least start with the first part of the question. If corruption is identified as the main threat to Afghans, why is the international community still pumping billions into the country? Who will, let's say, take on this challenge to answer this question?
We've been asking this question for 10 years already. It's a good question, but it's the American way. Throw money at a problem and it'll go away. But it doesn't. It causes more problems, obviously. In the top 3 recommendations, we've made hundreds of recommendations on this. But if you just take it down to the very project level of this $132 billion that we've spent in Afghanistan just on reconstruction, did anybody ever ask if the Afghans even wanted these projects, or if they needed these projects, or if they possibly could sustain these projects? And the answer, of course, is always no. It was something USAID, for example, thought was a great idea, and it just snowballed into billions and billions of dollars, much of it never with oversight. And on the military side, the commanders told us, look, we just don't care about the money. We're here to fight a war. Our job is not to look after, our job is not to build stuff, our job is to destroy stuff. So it was a crazy situation over there. The only reason it's gotten better is because the money is drying up.
Are you actually also saying a little bit, nobody really cares, or is that not what you're saying?
We came up with 7 questions for USAID to ask for every project they spent in Afghanistan before they spent $1 on that project. And, do they want it? Do they need it? Is it sustainable? Is it coordinated with our allies, et cetera? And, but by the time Cigar was created, they already had spent hundreds of millions of dollars. We were Johnny-come-lately with the United States Congress. So,
I'd like to add a consideration that has to do with our bureaucracies and our incentive structures, right? So one time I ran a conference with USAID people, meaning International Civilian Development people, and the sort of anti-corruption gang in the State Department. And when I was organizing the conference, a lot of USAID people came, working level people, came to me saying, we know this is terrible. We have an incentive structure that tells us we need to get the money out the door, right? That's how we are promoted within our own bureaucracies, is how much money we get out the door. So then I create the conference and I give them the floor, and they've got their boss in the room. They wanted me to say it. And I think the point is here, I get it, you know, people need their salaries and they've got kids in school and things like that. But we have to, if we give a damn about the missions that we're on, we have to start challenging the counterproductive incentive structures within our own institutions. We need to call our leadership on it. We need to gather a group of minions. If we don't want to stick our hand up and be the one whistleblower, you know, that's identified, let's gather a group and really challenge some of these incentive structures. That was one point, and I had another point, but if it comes back, I'll ask you for time.
Overarching, it could be also, let's say, who feels the pain. However, in your opinion, why such small involvement of NATO in combating spoilers? So I didn't ask the question, but for sure the person or persons that asked the question have the opinion that NATO has a small involvement in combating spoilers. So let's take it from there. Who would react on this question, please?
I would submit that I think there's, as I suggested, these networks are vertical. They go all the way to the top of the formal power structure as well as informal power structures, and therefore it gets really political. And you saw that arrow that I had pointing back out, and I said Dubai, and I said Miami, and I should say London and Paris. Our economies are predicated on a lot of this dirty money, believe me. And you know, so when you push this far enough, all of a sudden you're into the center of our own political systems. And we can think about Tony Blair, and we can think about Gerhard Schroeder, and we can think about the Clintons, and we can think about the Trumps, and you know, and so this gets extremely uncomfortable if you take it as far as it actually needs to go. And it requires, in my view, a very serious kind of candid look in the mirror, and that's hard to do.
It's a knowledge question. It's a number question. Any idea, do we have any idea about the numbers or percentage, or even, let's say, in brackets, how within Afghanistan police officers are handled with due to corruption? Maybe, Jean, I'm looking to you, you can say something about it.
Yeah, look, the Afghans have not been very good in prosecuting any of the any high-level officials. They'll get some low-level officials now and then, but not people that matter. And that's what we keep, the United States keeps pushing to do. So, I mean, they've got a long, long way to go. Their prosecutors are very young in office, and their judges are, the whole system is, you know, corrupt. So what Sakar is trying to do is work with the prosecutors we believe are honest, work with the courts that we believe are workable. We can't arrest Afghans, so we can only go after Americans, but we can push the Afghan prosecutors to do their job. I can't give you numbers, but it's not much, I tell you that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. What you're actually saying is, yes, we know it's there. Yes, we know it's the system. And yes, we know the system is, let's say, not able to, what you just said, Sarah, look into the mirror and take measures also in this case.
You give me an invitation. I have a microphone sitting out.
I was afraid
so.
So,
you know, right? Let me just say there are two other issues in terms of what to do that need to be borne in mind. One is, one of the police officials we did get, that was gotten early, and it was an international effort that pushed this, was a relatively unimportant border. I mean, his rank was fairly high. He was a district border police official in the South. But if you knew the informal structure, you understood that he didn't matter. What I came to understand was that sometimes going for the low-level folks who you can get because you've got the evidence and the evidence has been developed, and that can also be counterproductive because the locals know this guy doesn't matter, right? And so the message that it's sending is actually, we're only going after the small fish. And often the network wants that message to be sent, and so will sacrifice some small fish in order to send the message. And I have to say, again, personally, I was involved in a interagency approval of a narcotics kingpin designation of an Afghan drug dealer. And I mean, this guy was like one of the biggest drug dealers in the Afghan South, and oh great, he wasn't part of the Karzai network, so we could, it wasn't going to be politically uncomfortable to get him. I said, yeah, green light, yeah, go. I go down to Afghanistan, I say, well, what do you guys, my friends, what do you all think about this designation? They say, oh great, the US Treasury Department is also helping the Karzai network. I'm like, oh God, how did I not understand that that's how that would be seen? So, you really have to think about every operation is both a kinetic operation and an information operation. And you have to think through what is the information being transmitted by this operation. And the other thing I want to talk about that I didn't raise, and maybe it'll come up in question and conversation, but just to make sure it does, is sequencing. So I can imagine that you might, when you're building a peace agreement, you might say, okay, let's use the spoils as a lure to get the armed groups to make a deal, and that's sort of what happened in the Balkans. But then you need a clear sense of what's the off-ramp. How do we then wean either these individuals from the spoils or the system from these individuals? And if you think of that peace deal with the division of spoils built into it as the end point, then you're in trouble.
Thanks. Okay. Sara.
Again, I would recommend network link analysis, and starting with, I mean, all of this sounds easier in the abstract than it is in reality. But, there are bricks that if you pull certain bricks out of a wall, they weaken the wall more than pulling other bricks. So this is why intelligence-based strategy is really critical. And where we had initially again, sort of before cigar days, but we had at ISAF briefly a system that was a bottom-up system for targeting difficult members of government or, kind of allies. And in the end, I decided that was not the most effective way to do this, that you really did need to map the network and then ideally identify, for example, the critical nodes that connect public, private, and criminal. Like if you find a person who's triple-hatted, that could be an interesting, priority target. So you have to really think through your prioritizing. And again, I would emphasize that the panoply, and I've written it up in other documents and I can't sort of reel them off, but the panoply of possible pressure that you can put on people. If you think of law enforcement action and raiding banks as a kinetic targeting, that's way over on one end of the range. There's a whole other variety of ways of making people uncomfortable that can also be applied. So I would recommend developing for each, AOR, what are the different ways that we interact with these players, and that we could turn some screws that don't call upon the legal, the legal system.
Okay, can I get the questions on the screen? We are, let's say, step by step going to the end. I don't want to go on with the most voted questions, I'm sorry, but I would like to give you the chance to see if there is a question in which you think that should be answered.
I'd like to take the third one down. Who should be responsible for assessing the spoiler threats? I think that's a great question, and I do think that it needs to be a sort of, so I imagined some of this not so much in the context of a multinational intervention, but rather as an ongoing process for typical intervener countries, if you will. So I was thinking, again, a kind of fusion cell in the equivalent of the National Security Council in you name it country, right? To keep this going as a constant assessment for that country's major interlocutors. And you could imagine that the embassies would be in charge of constantly feeding information back into the kind of diagram, if you will, because these are dynamic systems also. But you could imagine that same notion in whatever the joint headquarters is or whatever, but I could easily see such a cell at NATO headquarters, again, as a fusion cell with, in an ongoing basis that would then necessarily have to be further refined ahead of a specific operation. But if at least you're not starting from scratch and you have a kind of working, rough diagram of typical intervenee, if you will, countries, I think that could be helpful.
I'm looking to the back of the room, the people that are, let's say, addressing the answers questions. You got this one? Good. Something to do for the workshop. Thank you so much. And I said, let's start with the conference again. We have 4 speakers. Major General Andrew Harrison, Brigadier General Robert Kabage. Did I say it correct, sir? Sure. Thank you very much. Chief Superintendent Jaime Gimenez. Jaime Gimenez. Thank you. And Minister Henry Wotton. And they are going to do their part of their speech. And after every presentation, we have the question answer. So please use the tool again. We do it at the same way we did it until now. And I would like to start by introducing Major General Andrew Harrison, who is the NATO Resolute Support Mission Deputy Advisor of the Afghan Ministry of Interior. Quite an impressive CV. He was commissioned into the Parachute Regiment and served multiple tours in Northern Ireland, Iraq, Australia, New Zealand, and for sure I forgot some. In 2000, he was posted to Sierra Leone as an unarmed UN observer. And on the outbreak of civil war, he was captured by rebels from the Revolutionary United Front. After 12 days, he escaped to a rebel-surrounded UN enclave. And following 3 months of isolation, the group were relieved in a UKSF or UN assault. He was appointed a member of the Order of the British Empire for his conduct in captivity. After several missions and assignments abroad and national, he assumed command of the 2nd Battalion, the Pursuit Regiment, and returned to Helmand. During a successful, but also challenging tour, he was wounded when struck by an RPG and appointed to the Distinguished Service Order for the leadership of his battle group. For the leadership. After being promoted to Major General, Major General Harrison was assigned as the senior British military representative in Afghanistan, and with this the responsibility for advising the Minister of Interior. I would love to give you the floor, sir. We're looking forward.
Thank you very much. And firstly, apologies. I'm in the wrong dress. It's always conspiracy or cock up. This is just cock up. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I know there's a lot of experience about Afghanistan. There's been many discussions about Afghanistan this morning. And I'm at the moment in the middle of the lived experience once again in Afghanistan. And I work for, or with Minister Andrea in the Ministry of Interior Affairs. We've heard a bit about that already this morning. Let me start by just giving you a snapshot of what Afghanistan is like for the police today. Imagine you're maybe in a checkpoint somewhere near Tarankot in the south, Pashtu South. You're in a checkpoint no bigger than this stage. You've been there for 6 months. You have no communication. The radio you have has no battery. The night vision goggles you had last year, American supplied, they've disappeared. There are 4 of you. You think you're being paid, but there's no phone signal, so you can't check whether your wages have gone through. You know there are attacks going on regularly all around you. You haven't been attacked in that 6 months, but every night you expect to be attacked. You haven't seen your officers. You get fed. Every second day, a Ford Ranger will drive 1/3 of the way up the mountain, drop the bucket of food, and that will be carried up to you, and you'll eat that over the next 48 hours with your 3 mates. There's no latrine. You just squat over the side, and that's how you live. And that's how you've lived for months, and that's how you're likely to live for months to come. Every night you think about dropping from roll, DFR, going AWOL, absent without leave, walking back home, but you don't know where home is, you don't know how to get there. Unlike most of your friends, you can't exploit the road that goes down at the bottom of the valley in order to gain illicit taxation and feed the corruption that we've heard about because it's too far to walk down. That's one picture. One picture of Afghanistan policing after we've been there for 19 years yesterday. That's when we started this endeavor, 19 years yesterday. And then you've got the other side of the coin. A month ago, in a compound just outside the airport in Kabul called Green Village, Haqqani Networked detonated a 3-ton vehicle-borne IED. A sub-nuclear explosion that could be heard right the way across the city and is one of 12 we've had in the last 6 months of this scale. There was an instant reaction from the GCPSU, the Police Special Forces. 222, probably their best unit, deployed immediately in their new Ford Rangers with their brilliant weapons, their 3rd generation night vision goggles. They've done this 100 times. They train every day, live firing. They've been trained for 18 years in how to do this, and they are good. So as they went through the breach where the HPA had been detonated, where the big bomb had gone off, they knew what they were doing. They are extremely capable. They went in on their own, without the Norwegian Special Forces who've been mentoring them. Their brick, a team of 4, operated through an area the size of a small village where there were 600 people cowering for their lives, being hunted down by 5 Haqqani terrorists that were in the building. And one by one, they found them and they killed them. All 5 were killed. In a special forces operation that Delta Force, the SAS, any of your special forces units would have been proud of. These are the two extremes of Afghan policing. There is no one Afghan police. It is different in one area to the next, one unit to the next. You don't hear much about the war in Afghanistan anymore. We live it. We talk about it. It's our job. It's our life. But you ask your friends back home. My friends think we've gone. They think we've left. They think the war's over. Occasionally they hear something, but it's not on the front pages anymore, and it's not in the daily discourse of the media. We've talked a lot this morning about corruption, about money, about the challenges of Afghanistan. Never once have we discussed the war. There is a bloody, brutal civil war, counterinsurgency, call it what you want, going on now and every day. And the police are in the front line of that war. Every night they're fighting and dying across Afghanistan. So we can't take any one of these problems, and there are many problems, and I'll come to that, in isolation. We have to take them in the context of that war that is going on. I'm on my third trip to this benighted country. Many of you will have been there many times more. I am not a natural optimist, but I am hopeful about Afghanistan. And it's not the cyclical hope of the sort of senior army officer who keeps coming back, comes in, has his great plan, gets his medal, goes home, and comes back in 3 years' time and does it again. I've been battered and bruised over there. I've lost good men and good women under my command, and I'm fed up with going there. So I know the reality of Afghanistan like I knew the reality of Iraq. And now, 18 years on, peace is coming. I have no doubt in my mind that we are on the road to peace. It won't be a full peace. It won't be a rapid peace. There won't be a beautiful path that we might plan out to a ceasefire, and then everyone goes back to their villages and drinks chai and the world is a happy place. It will be a bumpy road, and it will probably take years to get there, and it will not be a full and complete peace. It will simply be some form of reduction of violence. And then we will leave. This is my daughter. She's 21. Her name's Izzy. On Saturday, we got the news that she had passed selection to become an army officer in the British Army. So she'll go to Sandhurst next September. And we will leave, and in 3 years' time, she will go to Afghanistan again, and she will follow in her father's footsteps, and she will face the challenge that we've faced over those last 20 years. And why is that? It's because we will do the same that we did in Iraq. We will leave, as we left Iraq in 2011, before the job is finished. And all the problems that we've talked about this morning are the reasons we don't want to be there. And the fact it's not on the front page, and the fact it doesn't get political attention, and the fact it doesn't win votes, and the fact there is corruption, and I could go on and on and on, means we will go before the job is done, and she will have to go back and fight. So, in the afternoon speech, where I'm sure one or two are snoozing, let me just give those deductions. So peace is coming. NATO and the Resolute Support Mission will leave when the moment comes, and then we'll end up going back sooner than we think. But before I give you my suggestions about what we should do and why, let me explain some things that are going on now, because I'm 2 days out of date. Many of you will be a bit more than that. But the reason I'm hopeful, and the reason I talked about hope, is because as we speak, there is a new generation that are coming through. 18 years of high quality teaching and mentoring has developed things in Afghanistan that only now are starting to break through the crust of that barren, corrupt, drug-ridden country. We're working on 8 areas, and it's difficult. It's really difficult with the Ministry of Interior. And it's easy. You could pick another 8, but these are the things we're focusing on at the moment. Reforming the Ministry of Interior, again. Improving the skills of the 34 provincial chiefs of police. Remediating, trying to fix the 5,600 checkpoints that are across Afghanistan, and that's just the police checkpoints. Improving women's rights, that eternal challenge in the most difficult country for improving women's rights in the world. Maintaining the quality of those GCPSU special forces. Their warrant-driven reputation is second to none. And the 2 cross-cutting themes of training and logistics. In some of these areas, progress is fast. To be honest, in most of them, progress is glacial. The reasons for the challenges are expansive, broad, widely documented. On my desk in Kabul, I probably have something in the region of 60 documents that many of you have written describing the problems and the challenges of Afghanistan. Let me just highlight 4 of them. And the first goes back to my original point. The ongoing war. Never forget the context of that violence that is a part of every day in Afghanistan, in which the Afghan police do the bulk of the fighting, not the army. The endemic corruption that we've talked about this morning and that influences every part of Afghan lives. The constant churn of people. Let me just describe this. So I'm there for a year. Many of you have been there 6 months or year tours. So the average for us is probably 8 months. There have been 14 ministers of interior over the last 18 years. So if you put those 2 together, you work out the average relationship between an advisor and a minister is something in the region of 5 months, 6 months. So what do we rely on in our institutions? The corporate memories provided by our civil service. In the Ministry of Defence and Minister of Interior, that civil service simply doesn't exist as an entity. And therefore, when a new minister comes in, he brings in his new team. So that churn is like a cancer that prevents any proper growth and fitness of the body. And then, unlike Iraq, the low levels of education, human capital, and the challenges of human rights across the country. So that's just 4 to start with. Again, I could talk for an hour on that. But how do we accelerate the change? Because I often sit with people who will spend an hour describing the problems to me. And I don't need anyone to describe the problems. I live the problems and have lived the problems. It's how we can improve. What can we do to make that place work? We know we've been there for 18 years. I don't need anyone to tell me that. I don't need anyone to go through what's wrong. We need ideas how to make it work, how we can prevent Izzy going back there in 3 years. And I make this not in any way in defense of how long it's taken us. It is criminal, the efforts that we've made and the failures that we've delivered over the time. And we are all responsible in some way, shape or form. We are all responsible. But we now have to move forward, because what is the other option? And we can move forward, and there is a way out. As I say, I'm not a naive, optimistic officer. I've seen this too long and too often. But we can succeed because of this tranche of leadership that is now coming through. And many of you probably aren't aware of that. But let me look at my ministry. This guy, Andrea, he is a technocrat. He's come from the NDS. He's young, 40 odd. He's able. He could be sitting, it's probably no advert, but he could be sitting in Westminster or Washington doing the job he's doing as the Minister of Interior in the US or the UK. I haven't identified how he's corrupt yet. He might not be corrupt. I hope he's not corrupt. I've been working with him for 6 months and I've seen nothing to indicate that he is corrupt. He can't deal with some of the corruption that exists at the very highest levels, but he knows that, and he knows that we know that. But it's better that he's in the tent trying to deal with the challenges than gets himself thrown out on one issue of corruption. He is a product of 20 years of teaching from America, UK, and countries who've been assisting. Khoshal Sadat, Deputy Minister for Security, 37 years old, product of the GCPSU units I was talking about. He's replaced 27 of the 34 provincial chiefs of police in the last 6 months. He is out there on the streets every night, trusted by the people, trained by the US, UK, Ranger School, Staff College. Again, no indications he's corrupt, worked for McChrystal, etc., etc. Hosna Jalil, 27 years old, Deputy Minister for Strategy and Policy. She come from Kabul, internationally educated, mentored by the First Deputy Minister, trusted and respected in the Ministry of Interior as a 27-year-old woman. 2 years ago, that would have been incredible. 4 years ago, that would have been impossible, but it's happening. So what's happening is that there are a crop of able leaders who over the last 18 years, the international community have mentored, educated, and brought through. And 5 years ago, 3 years ago, when I'd been there before, there'd been one or two, and there'd been tall poppies who have risen up and have been cut down by the challenges around them. But now there is a crop coming up of which the old Soviet-educated, obviously corrupt, old generation are the exceptions. They are the weeds now in this young technocratic politic that is starting to rise in Afghanistan. And I say this again, I repeat, because it's really important. Not because I have blind optimism, but because I genuinely believe it. And I'm hopeful in that regard. So what do we have to do now in order to take us forward? In order not just to be, as Roosevelt said, not the critic that counts, it's the man who's in the arena. We're all in the arena. We are in the arena of making Afghanistan a better place. So what do we have to do to carry that through and prevent that 21-year-old woman going back there like my friends and colleagues went back into Iraq? Well, we've got to help this generation take root, however we do it. Because if that churn continues, and if everything turns over again for the multitude of reasons it might do, then we will lose them and we will get something that is worse than what's there at the moment. Under Afghan guidance, we've got to build an effective, an affordable, a sustainable, they're the words you're all familiar with, but we've got to build a police force that is ready to police the peace that is coming. Because the army will go back in some way, shape or form, and it will be left with this police force to look after the people of Afghanistan into the next generation. And that work is underway. So there are two big projects that you need to be aware of. One is called Future Force. And put simply, it is how the Americans predominantly, but the international community can fund the Future Force into the next 5 years. And it's big money. And it's got to get through Congress, and it's a challenge. It's nothing like the money that's being spent now, but the Afghans can't afford their own security force for the near future. And if they can't afford it and no one else pays for it and the international donor community don't contribute, then that security force will simply melt away as it did under the Soviets, and then chaos will reign again. And the second is the project that is post-peace policing. What is the model that we want for the Afghan police after peace comes? Some form of peace. And we can't say. It is a mix of three institutions that will decide that, and they've got to be talking and working together. The first and most importantly is the Afghans. And they have a new government that's forming or is about to form, and so that provides an opportunity, a waypoint. The second is the international community, who over the last 20 years have been pretty awful at working together in security issues in Afghanistan. And the thirdly is the Resolute Support Mission that is there, but under NATO's auspices will leave in due course. NATO may well stay on. So those three bodies have to work together to come up with a plan in the next few months, definitely within the year, so it's ready when we get to that ceasefire, to that next opportunity, that there is something on the shelf that we can work from. And then, finally, what is the international community going to do? When Resolute Support finishes, and it will, what are we going to do about policing and scaffolding that organisation? Are we going to throw our burdens on our shoulders and all go home? That's an option. The job is done, and I've already described what I think will happen then. Is another mission going to take over? Could be NATO, could be UN, could be UPOL. We know the challenges they've faced over recent years. Is it going to be a single nation that leads? America, Turkey, Germany, UK, who knows? Or are there going to be a series of stovepipes, of silos, of policing training going on across the country from any country that wishes a bilateral relationship? Now, I think the best opportunity is for some form of policing advisory coalition, not military. My organisation now, we're getting rid of the military, and it's becoming more and more civilian dominated to inform the Ministry of Interior, and police dominated to inform the police and emergency services. So ideally it's a coalition that comes together, but it might not be. But we need that conversation in the next few months, in the next year, to establish what we, the international community, wants to do for Afghanistan. I'll pause there and take any questions.
Let's start that we understand that we are living in freedom, and I cannot not react on part of your speech. Let's not forget that we're living in countries in which our people are free to make own choices. And let's not forget that when parents allow their children to make their own choices, that this is explaining and expressing the freedom we have. And understanding what it will mean for the children, and the courage to share it with us, I envy. Thank you for that. Sir, you gave an overview over the real circumstances for police in Afghanistan. 2 examples. Daily work, police in front line, what is really happening. You said peace incoming, I'm sure. But the question is it the peace we know, and it will be a bumpy road? You gave the description of the daily developments in Afghanistan, and also what happens with a lot of changes in the politics and what it means for the people in work. But then again, you also shared with us your future positive signs on development in the leadership. I won't say too much about because you all heard it, so I would like to get up some questions on the screen and ask you if we can pick out some. Again, we have a lot of questions, so let's see which we can answer. Okay, everybody can read for himself. Sir, would you be able to address this question, please? Question is, do you need stability policing?
It's a thesis. Yes, there is no doubt we need stability policing, but I think the time, as I said in my speech, the time where we need the military to oversee the policing role is waning. I think we're now in a position where we need people who are real experts in the ministry and in police, the execution of police policy. I don't need people to explain how to put mine tape up and work on checkpoints. I need people to explain how to make human resources management work, how a ministry functions, a ministry of state functions, not a ministry of defense. For too long, the army and the police have been grouped as the security forces, as one entity. We now need the police to form their own identity as a police force. Now that model might be elements of community policing, gendarmerie, that's for the future to decide what the model should be. But it certainly isn't to have 5,600 checkpoints with rusty AK-47s and no leadership. There has to be now, into this peace process when it comes, a shift of the police into doing the job of policemen. And the more assistance we get from communities and countries that are scarred by the last 18 years of experience in Afghanistan, the better it will be for all of us. But it will be a really significant political challenge. UPOL burnt. UN burnt. NATO, you know. I think most people just want to go, but if we go now, the job isn't done. So it will be our politicians' choice.
Quite clear, I think. Thank you. So you're actually being asked to, let's say, apply on a position in Cigar, correct?
Yeah, I have many great discussions about Cigar. You can imagine, I think it's really important we work together. Gene and his team identify lots of really significant issues and make many suggestions about how things can improve, and we're really grateful for that inspection that goes on, and it gives us ammunition when we need resources to tackle challenges as well. There is no doubt that the money has been squandered by the billions. Corruption is endemic, as I've described, but it is a problem that can't be taken in isolation. So if corruption goes right to the top and right to the bottom, and I'm not naming names, but it does, then you can't get rid of everyone. So you have to work out a system of who you get rid of, how you do that, the information operation that accompanies that. Those challenges are huge, and they are not military challenges, and there is no organization that is set up to do that. So there's much conversation this morning about pulling together teams to organize this sort of operation. But if you think about that, and there was discussion just before lunch about having NATO team. Where is the doctrine? Where is the training? Where are the lines of development that we always talk about? Are we really going to get our secret intelligence agencies, who provide so much of the information about this corruption, to talk to one another or talk to NATO? I mean, tell me where that's happened successfully on this scale anywhere in the world. So we need to think hard and continue to come up with workarounds. But sometimes the simplest solutions just don't work. And if there had been a simple solution, we'd have done it 17 years ago. So that's the challenge to all of us, to work out ways we can get the agencies that provide much of this information to talk to one another within a construct that people understand, with people who are trained. And this is a country of 34 million. And frankly, everyone is just trying to survive. And I think if most of you were out there on the checkpoints, you would be skimming money off the vehicles that went past as well. And that's the honest truth.
Thank you. Could you please turn up the questions we have and not pick one? Okay, so as I said also this morning, there are more questions. These are the most voted. Sir, I would like you to pick out the question that you think out of these three should be answered.
Well, I can't answer the last one.
Thank you for the answer.
I mean, let me take the top one. Redirect the stream of development funds that, according to SIGAR, has been squandered by the billions. And I come back to this. It is about, in my mind, getting the checks and balances in place in the context of the current war that's underway. So we call it Hobson's choice in the UK. So either you accept that there is corruption, or you turn off the assistance to the Afghan government and it fails and the Taliban win, and those organizations, ISIS, Haqqani, Al-Qaeda, are reborn and the problem starts again in Afghanistan. So there is no easy solution, but the more oversight we can provide, the better the checks and balances. Probably most importantly, the better the leadership. And I hope you have a germ of optimism with what I've said. If the leadership is in place, then everything else will flow from that. And there are some hard choices in deciding who are the leaders that we support. And arguably, we've got it wrong for a very long time. So, for me, at the heart of it isn't manipulating systems. It's about getting the right people in and continuing to provide them good mentorship, good oversight, and good advice.
Thank you so much, sir. I would like to wrap it up. Thank you for what you gave us and for the answering of the questions. I will go on with our next speaker. Which will be Brigadier General Robert Kabage, who is the Senior Monitoring and Evaluation Officer at the African Union, Peace Support Operations Division. He served in the Kenyan Defense Forces for a period of 35 years, about experience. During his service, he held various command, staff, and training appointments. His last appointment was Chief of Systems at the Kenya Defense Forces HQ. Other key Other key appointments were Director of International Peace Support Training Center in Kenya, Defense Attaché at the Kenya Mission to the United Nations in New York, and Corps Commander of the Kenya Army Ordnance Corps. Sir, may I?
Thank you so much for that introduction. Let me start by congratulating the organizers of this conference and thank them for inviting the African Union to contribute to this very important topic. This afternoon, I bring a perspective of the African Union police component in Somalia as part of the African Union mission in Somalia, AMISOM. The police component is deployed in Somalia as part of the African Peace and Security Architecture. This is a framework that was established in 2002 to address the various security challenges in the African continent. It comprises 5 pillars. The first pillar is the Peace and Security Council. This is the main decision-making organ on issues of peace and security. The other pillar is the Continental Early Warning System, which analyzes situations and provides decision makers with timely information and options to respond to crises in the continent. The panel of the WISE is a diplomacy and mediation capacity. Then we have the Peace Fund. It's a mechanism for financing peace operations in the continent. And the last one is the African Standby Force. This is an integrated response capacity made up of military, police, and civilian elements. And the African component, the African police component deployed in Somalia is part of this framework, the African Standby Force. Allow me to give you a short background of AMISOM, or the African Union Mission in Somalia. It is an active regional support mission that was mandated by the African Peace and Security Council in 2007, and it was supposed to deploy for only 6 months. The mission was also endorsed by the United Nations in the same year, and it was mandated to provide support to the transitional federal institutions in Somalia, facilitate provision of humanitarian assistance, and create conducive conditions for long-term stabilization, reconstruction, and development in the country. But over a decade later, the African Union and United Nations continues to extend the mandate of AMISOM based on joint African Union and UN review assessments. In May this year, the United Nations adopted Resolution 2472 to extend the mandate of AMISOM to 31st May next year. And within that mandate, they directed the military to reduce by 1,000 by February 2020, but maintain the strength of the police to 1,040 in line with the Somali transitional plan. The police are supposed to support gradual and condition-based transition from AMISOM to Somali police-led internal security, an extension of states' authority, rule of law, and access to justice by 2021. when AMISOM is supposed to exit the stage. A short highlight or update on the police component. The first contingent of the police component in Somalia was deployed in 2012. And this was the first time that the African Union was deploying a police contingent in a peace support operations environment. It was mandated to train, mentor, monitor, and advise the Somali police force. Its objective is to transform the Somali police force into a credible and effective force adhering to strict international standards. Currently, the contingent has 3 formed police units and over 200 individual police officers. They're deployed in a number of cities. The first one is in Mogadishu. The other one is in Baidoa. The other one is in Kismayo, Belatuen, and Joha. This is where they are deployed. Assessment process of spoiler threats in Somalia. As in any other fragile state, the issue of spoiler threats in Somalia was a concern during the police mission planning phase and even during the mandate implementation. The police contingent planners had to contend with the question of who is a spoiler in Somalia context and how do they manage their impact on operations. They had to undertake potential spoiler threat assessment process through the stages of identification, inquiry as to what motivates the spoilers, analysis of their capabilities, and how to manage their impact on the police operations. So, as part of the identification, spoilers in Somalia are identified as leaders, individuals, and organizations who believe that emerging peace and emerging peace processes threatens their power, it threatens their authority, and it threatens their interests. They use violence and any other sabotage activities to undermine or stop efforts to deliver peace in Somalia. They include the Al-Shabaab militants, terrorist fighter groups, clans, federal member states, members of the local business community, warlords, religious groups, and other extremist groups operating in the country. The methods used by the police component to identify spoilers and spoiler threats in Somalia include: 1, the means of attack. The method of attack and means of violence used against the targets, like the security forces, the peacekeepers, and the local community, will assist the police component to identify which type of spoiler they are dealing with. The use of suicide bombs, IED, vehicle-based IEDs are attributed to Al-Shabaab militants. The other one, they identify them through defectors. When some of the defectors surrender to our police component, they are debriefed and they will give a lot of information. The other one is through reports, because we have established policing activities and other initiatives to be able to understand the spoilers that we are dealing with at any one time. We have hotlines that have been established suggestion boxes, and with this, you get a lot of information. Others are police investigations. When an incident happens and police go out to investigate, then they get a lot of information. Security intelligence is also important, and it assists them to identify the type of spoiler that they are dealing with. Social media, and it was mentioned here by one of the speakers, this one is used a lot within the country, and when they are monitored and intercepted, you can get a lot of information, especially on Al-Shabaab. Artificial intelligence means is also another way of identifying the spoilers. Using equipment like the drones, computers, data analysis machines, and CCTV, you can be able to get a lot of information. The level of the assistance to the peace process will also give you a lot of information. The manner in which they oppose positive political and development changes in their areas, especially the clans, because clanism is highly entrenched in Somalia, and they will oppose any positive change depending on the interest that they have to the process. The other stage within the cycle is the inquiry process, and this seeks to understand the factors that motivate the spoilers and how they remain resilient even after AMISOM having been in Somalia for so long. One of the motivating factors is the clan dynamism. Clans are cohesive and easily manipulated to shield and protect their own, possibly because they acquire power and they share resources with the clan. They have that belief that once one of our own has got the power, they have the resources, then we will benefit as a clan. And this drives them a lot. The other one is fear of prosecution. Those who have committed atrocities over the years, they would wish the status quo to be sustained. And so they will make sure that they fight and they do all they can to sustain the status quo. Ideological fundamentalism was also another factor that was one of the speakers talked about it. Spoilers like the Al-Shabaab, they consider waging jihad against enemies of Islamism, and this serves as a justified cause for them to continue with the atrocities that they carry out in the operation area or in Somalia. Corruption, I don't think I have to talk about it. We have hammered this one. I think all the speakers have talked about it. It is a key factor that motivates the spoilers to wish to sustain the status quo as much as possible. Use of asymmetrical warfare, the use of IEDs, the use of VBIEDs. Whenever they use this one against the peacekeepers, it has been very successful, and it motivates them a lot. And so they continue using this one to sustain their operations. Links with international terrorist networks is also another motivating factor. Some of the terrorist groups like Al-Shabaab, they have links with other international networks like Al-Qaeda, like Boko Haram, because they seem to have a justified cause for whatever they do. And so they continue getting support, and this motivates them, and it makes them to be resilient for so long. Another factor is the federal government of Somalia versus the federal member states. There is always a stalemate. The federal member states are always conscious of the activities of the central government. They don't want them to interfere in, so one would say they are tough. And so they always make sure that they fight to sustain their power and their authority. The other one is linkage with local population. And this also goes back to the clanism, the clan dynamics that I talked about. Because most spoiler groups have very strong support among the local population. They project themselves as service providers where the government is not, in areas where government service is not provided. And so they tend to look like they will provide the service. And they also use this to get loyalty from the people. The other one is revenue generation, and I think we have, most of the speakers have also talked about this. Most spoiler groups generate revenue from international sympathizers, the diaspora, the local population, through all means, extortion and illegal taxation and others. And so they fight to sustain the status quo. The other factor is inadequate critical police operational assets. The AMISOM police component has got insufficient assets, operational assets, like the armored personnel carriers, and so they might not be able to conduct offensive operations as much as they would. And so this one also enables the spoilers to continue operating in areas that, if the police component had the capability, they had the enablers, then they would be able to get to those locations. And the last one is this limited capacity of the Somali National Security Forces. So that you realize that where the AMISOM police or the AMISOM forces have been able to liberate some of the areas, the Somali National Security Forces or the Somali police, they are supposed to take over and hold those areas. But because of their limited capacity, then it becomes a problem. And this, of course, sustains the various spoilers that we have in the country. The analysis process. This is intended to generate options and strategies to manage spoiler impact on operations. And they use some of the following method. One is the capability threat analysis, which is conducted to understand the spoiler capacities to cause harm, and using that, they limit the impact of the spoilers. The other one is intelligence on the spoilers to ensure that they understand how they can be able to coordinate the response against the spoilers. Organizational cohesion analysis is also important. This one helps to exploit the lifts, because within some of the spoiler groups, like the Al-Shabaab, they have lifts with among the various groups. And so when they undertake this organizational cohesion analysis, then they can understand the areas of weaknesses and they can be able to exploit that one against the spoilers. The modus operandi of the spoilers is also important. They conduct this one to understand the equipment, the mechanisms of operation, and how they can be able to counter that. The public support analysis is also important, so that they can understand what is it that motivates the public to support the spoilers, and how can they be able to counter that, especially on areas of humanitarian support. Because whoever can be able to support the civilians, whoever can be able to support the local population, then they get that support. So the AU police have got to understand what is it that is motivating the population to support the spoilers, especially the Al-Shabaab. And finally is the resource analysis. How are they getting resourced? How are they getting revenue? How are they getting supported? And how can they be able to counter this? The fourth stage is the spoiler management process, and this generates measures of managing spoiler effectiveness through a number of interventions. One is the use of force, where we have Al-Shabaab and the attacking the peacekeepers. then we will use force against them. De-radicalization against the fundamentalism groups is also important. We also exploit ideological lifts to reduce cohesion, and I explained this. There is a group that is called Sunnah wal Jamaa, which has got different ideology with Al-Shabaab. And so they have lifts that the police usually exploit this to make sure that they counter the Al-Shabaab. Target of senior terrorist leaders is also another method or another strategy to address the spoiler threats. International effort, this one is to encourage the international community to bring their effort to bear on the Al-Shabaab menace, especially in Somalia. And it is also, because Al-Shabaab is also a threat to international community. And so it would be important that the international community brings their efforts to bear on this threat. The other one is amnesty. The federal government of Somalia at times is encouraged to grant amnesty against some spoilers so that they can be able to defect and surrender to the peacekeepers. Offensive AMISOM operations, whenever we have targets that have been identified, then the offensive operations are conducted in those areas to be able to counter their intentions. Enhanced Somali police force capacity, this one is important because by 2021, AMISOM is supposed to exit Somalia. And so it is important that the capacity of the Somali police force is enhanced to be able to take over their security responsibilities in the country. And the last one is dialogue. This is also key because the federal government of Somalia needs to dialogue with potential spoilers where they have been identified and address their fears and possibly concerns. And this could also assist to reduce their motivation. Discredit campaigns is also another one, where you conduct campaigns on spoilers to change the public perception and deny the local support to the various spoilers. Deny of revenue sources is also another strategy that can be used against the spoilers. By monitoring and controlling financial support are channeled to the terrorist groups from internal and external sources. So let me say that the other portion of our discussion this afternoon is assessment of spoiler threats, a responsibility or a shared requirement. Yes, it is a shared requirement because today's operational environment is too complex to be left to one organization like the African Union. The African Union, therefore, and even the police component in particular, welcomes partners like the UN, the EU, and NATO to contribute to efforts to assess and defeat potential spoiler threats in Somalia. This can be achieved through provision of analysis equipment support, sharing of intelligence and information on the spoilers, enhancing the police capacity, the Somali police capacity, and even the AMISOM police capacity, and lastly, providing humanitarian support to those areas that require all the spoilers exploit by providing support, especially those areas where the government presence is limited. These are some of the areas that we can be able to work together as the international community to ensure that we address the issue of spoiler threats in Somalia and within the AMISOM police component. I thank you.
So while we're making, let's say, hey man, you're fast. Perfect. So thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for addressing AMISOM and give us an overview on the several organizations, as well as the explanation of the process and the police contingent. The 4 steps: identification, inquiry, analysis, and the managed impact on the operation, and helping us through the process to understand, and closing up what we could do internationally. Thank you for giving us this. For now, I would like to invite you to go with us through some questions. If you can, please show up the first one.
In response to this question, that police forces having a military structure and status have been providing policing services to populations in many African countries. What is my experience to their success is their military background advantages. One, I would say the military background is advantageous to the extent that it instills the aspect of discipline. And so if I went further to highlight the problem in Somalia, the Somali police have got a problem of discipline. And so having military structures that is organized, that is harmonious and homogeneous, it instills the aspect of discipline, and I'm sure it would be able to assist the police organization in their operations activities.
So it's actually saying it's giving structure, and therefore it's helping the leadership to get better in position, helping the police. Is that, let's say, a summary of what you're saying?
Sure, sir.
Thank you. It's a difficult question, sir. You could make it easy and say yes or no. I would like to ask you not to do that. So if you might, let's say, go a little bit deeper into it.
Let me not give a yes or no answer, but agree that it depends on the level or the stage of the operation. Like you have seen in Somalia, we started in 2007. It's over a decade and 2 years later, and the situation still requires a military effort. We have a military force of 19,000 in Somalia against a police force of 1,000. So the situation still requires that military solution, but when it starts tilting now to the stability effort, then the primacy of the police will take over. Thank you.
Yes. Little thing on my way, I shouldn't be doing it because it almost sounds like an opinion, so don't take it as an opinion. Generally in operations, I don't think one can go without another, to be very honest. The challenge is how do you use the, let's say, police, gendarmerie, armed forces the best way. But it's not an opinion, it's an idea. Next one, please.
Well, the military will be commanded by a force commander. The police component will be commanded by the police commissioner. I'm not aware of the NATO policy, but I see the police forces would be available for roles such as the senior advisor to the Minister of Interior. The AU policy is that at the level of the head of mission, during a scenario, like we have a number of scenarios within the AU PSO context, scenario 1 to scenario 6. Scenario 6 is the rapid deployment phase. The head of mission at that point would be a military officer because he's the one leading the operation. But as the situation now improves to a scenario 5, which is a peace support operation, then a civilian head of mission will take over. So to that extent, I would say that within a scenario 6, the force commander would be the head of mission, but as the situation improves to a scenario 5, to a peacekeeping operation, then the head of mission would be a civilian.
So if I understand what you're saying, the AU is some sort of similar with the UN, depending on what states of the mission you're in, correct? Okay, thank you. Could you bring up all the questions, please? Well, not all the questions, there's too many, but this is, let's say, the most voted questions. I would like to also invite you to pick out a question of which you think that should not be unanswered at this time.
Let me answer the second question from the bottom. AMISOM was actually
it's not this one, I think.
criticized for inactivity across Somalia. In fact, targeted killings and roadside bombs to be named, but a few flourish. Don't you think that a more proactive approach will prevent widespread violence across this for so long? Yeah. But the thing is, I think whoever asked this question is right. We were criticized harshly, but I think it was not fair. Because AMISOM is equally bearing the brunt of the roadside bombs. We are conducting patrols, daily patrols. We are conducting proactive operations. And that, I said, is one of the mitigating factors that we use against the spoilers. So it is not fair to say that we are not doing anything against the roadside bombs. We are bearing the brunt of all this, even ourselves, as peace support operation.
Bringing out missions, sending out people, trying to do the best, is the hard thing. Being criticized and helping with solutions is a good thing. Being criticized, period, is a different thing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
So I would like to start with, and again, here's the name thing, Chief Superintendent Jaime Cuenca Gimenez. He's the senior UN police officer and team leader within the UNDPO, standing police capacity. He brings 22 years of policing experience at national and international levels by serving in, for example, UNMIC, Kosovo, UNMIT, and the Integrated Training Service. With the EU, he has also participated in 3 Frontex operations and was appointed the chair of the Cross-Cutting Issues Working Group on EU Missions, EUPCST. Frans, for sure, you know about this. The present chairman. Prior to his appointment, he commanded the Immigration and Border Service in Valencia as Chief Superintendent of the Spanish National Police. Jaime, if you will enlighten us, please.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start, let's say, with giving you a bit of a background, just for a few minutes, of what the standing police capacity is, if you allow me. It's just a small 30-person unit, small group of experts that we're based, thanks to Mark Kruger here, in Brindisi. I was just joking. And what we do is we do deploy bringing our expertise to both mission and non-mission settings, right? And in peace operations, it's not anymore DPKO, it's now DPO since the 1st of January. And to non-mission settings, and I'll give you a few examples later during my speech. I didn't prepare a PowerPoint, so my apologies for that, but please, if you're going to break your neck, just step out and come back later, okay? I wanted to talk today about conflict prevention, and I was wondering, and I really hope I'm not at the wrong conference, right? Because you know we've been hearing a lot about Afghanistan, etc. But I just wanted to talk about conflict prevention and why. First of all, because Katalin said okay. Thank you, Katalin, for that. And secondly, because as you can understand, is the trend, the tendency. The Secretary General has clearly emphasized the need for conflict prevention. And we have to understand it in the current financial constraints and financial status that United Nations is. We could talk for hours and hours about the budget and blah, 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 but this is not the right forum. So please allow me to talk about conflict prevention, because simply prevention works. And in many countries have successfully managed high-risk conflicts and avoided descents into violence. These experiences offer lessons in prevention that can be applied to other contexts. Prevention is about creating incentives for actors to choose actions that resolve conflict without violence. Inclusive approaches to prevention should recognize and address group grievances early. Violence is highly path-dependent. Once it takes hold, incentives and systems begin to reorient themselves in ways that sustain violence. There's been a surge in violent conflicts in recent years. That surge has left a trail of human suffering, displacement, and prolonged humanitarian needs. In 2016, more countries experienced violent conflicts than at any other time in the last 30 years. This surge in violence afflicts both low and middle income countries. Not only low income countries as we might fathom, but no, also middle income countries with relatively strong institutions, and calls into question the long-standing assumption that peace will accompany income growth and the expectation of steady social, economic, and political advancement that defined the end of the 20th century. If current trend persists, by 2030, which, as you know, is a horizon for the SDGs, right, the Sustainable Development Goals, half of the world's poor will be living in countries affected by high levels of violence. Hence, the benefit of preventive action is and seems self-evident. This reality has accelerated momentum for countries at risk and for the international community to focus on improving efforts at preventing the outbreak, escalation, recurrence, or continuation of conflict, as the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council 2016 resolutions highlights. Yet, conflict prevention remains a relatively under-publicized aspect of the UN's work. Media tend to cover crises after they have turned violent, when dramatic scenes are more likely to capture audience attention. The UN Security Council, which has a key responsibility in the prevention of violent conflict, has historically focused on the management of immediate crises and large-scale conflicts. Compounding the low visibility of conflict prevention is the difficulty in measuring the UN's impact in averting, again, the outbreak, escalation, continuation, and recurrence of violent conflicts, given the challenge of demonstrating that a given action resulted in conflicts not taking place. The UN's approach has evolved over time. The mentioned resolutions on sustaining peace reinforce this new approach. the UN works at a variety of points along the conflict cycle, addressing issues that present long-term risks and engaging with parties that are on the brink of violence, helping to negotiate the end to conflicts, and assisting countries to achieve reconciliation and build resilient and inclusive societies. The type of activities vary along a spectrum from broad and long-term to targeted and short-term, and can be employed simultaneously. At one end of the spectrum are activities focused on the structural causes of conflict, which aim to strengthen the institutions and social mechanisms of states and societies, helping them to become more resilient to the causes and triggers of conflicts. This includes work in areas such as governance, rule of law and security sector reform, electoral assistance and gender equality. In that regard, I can tell you, for instance, that the SPC nowadays will go soon to Somalia to help both AMSOM and AMISOM plan for the elections that come in, I believe, by the end of next year, right? We've been in Malawi also for roughly 6 months, assisting the country on preparing for the elections that took place in June this year. So regarding gender, we were a few months ago also in Liberia regarding gender mainstreaming, helping the police force over there in that regard with some policy, etc. So that is the kind of activities that we do and that the police force, the international police forces can carry out to make institutions, in this regard, the police force, more resilient and maybe more gender responsive and better prepare for elections. However, as a situation deteriorates, the state institutions become less effective, societies less cohesive and more susceptible to economic shocks. At this stage, preventive diplomacy can play an important role in influencing the decision-making of key actors on whether or not to engage in or escalate violence. The UN role in conflict prevention has undergone important innovations over the last few years. Peace operations have increased their focus on preventing conflict, escalation or recurrence. New thematic and technical capacity support the good offices of the Secretary General, as well as his or her special envoys and representatives, including heads of regional office on the ground. And in recent years, cases of unconstitutional changes of governments, fragile electoral processes, and large-scale human rights violations have all been addressed through preventive diplomacy. I remember I was also part of the team that started up the mission in Yemen, Amha. I was later called. And as you might all recall, we were deployed after the Stockholm Agreement was signed. It took a lot of efforts. It's still not a situation that we can call it resolved, far from that. But we're still there in Hodeida, which is where we are now based, the mission, Amha, trying to mediate between both parties in order to come up with an agreeable solution to the security forces. It's difficult, but that's what we do every day. But I would also like to bring hope and good news to this discussion. Despite the numerous spoiler factors, allow me please to briefly cover an example out of many that reinforce this approach. We could cover, for instance, Liberia, which since the signing of the peace agreement and the establishment of the National Transitional Government and the deployment of UNMIL, Liberia has undergone a significant transformation, avoided a relapse into civil war, and is on the path to sustained stability. Through the commitment and determination of the people and governments, with support from regional and international partners, the country has built new institutions based on democratic principles and the rule of law, while advancing national reconciliation and addressing the root causes of violence. It also overcame the Ebola outbreak in 2014, which threatened to reverse all gains made since the end of the Civil War. It's also an honor to say that SPC is also contributing to the Ebola Task Force in Congo, with one representative that every day, of course, is, as you can understand, going through a very difficult situation, trying to somehow train and do capacity building of the Congolese police force on how to tackle the Ebola. The Ebola Task Force is, as you know, is a UN dedicated team, and it's a priority for the Department of Peace Operations. But since we're here also to talk about threats and spoilers, I thought it would be also good to cover some of the threats or risks that we can face when we are trying to advance the agenda for conflict prevention. For conflict prevention to be successful, there is a need to understand the root causes of the looming conflict and also the factors and threats that can derail our efforts. Some of the greatest risks of violence today stem from the mobilization of perceptions of exclusion and injustice, rooted in inequalities across. When an aggrieved group assigns blame to others or to the states for its perceived economic, political, or social exclusion, then emotions, collective memories, frustration over unmet expectations, and a narrative that rouses a group to violence can all play a role in mobilizing to violence. People come together in social groups for a variety of reasons. They may share feelings, history, narratives, frustrations, or identities, right? And that motivate them to collectively take action in different ways and in different situations. Perceptions of inequality between groups often matter more in terms of mobilization than measured inequality and exclusion. This pattern of exclusion includes inequality in the distribution of and access to political opportunity, including access to the executive branch and the police and the military. What we cannot have, and you all will all agree with me, is to have a police force that is not representative of the society it serves. That will only lead to grievances, and in the long run, we will have conflicts. The same with gender. If gender normally is half of the population we're serving, why not having a larger number of female police officers? Of course, it's very easy to say, because I also come from a country where female police officers do not represent a big percentage. But that's a tendency, and I'm happy to say that we will get there eventually. Societies that offer more opportunities for youth participation in the political and economic realms and provide routes for social mobility for youth tend to experience less violence. This is especially important nowadays. With the global youth population increasing, the ability to harness the energy and potential of youth presents a strong opportunity for this unique demographic dividend. Cross-country studies find evidence that high levels of gender inequality and gender-based violence in a society are associated with increased vulnerability to civil war and interstate war and the use of more severe forms of violence in conflict. Changes in women's status or vulnerability, such as an increase in domestic violence or a reduction in girls' school attendance, often are viewed as early warnings for a social and political insecurity. Prevention of violent conflict requires a strong focus on women's experiences and on measures to ensure their participation in political, social, and economic life. Some evidence suggests that when women take leadership roles and are able to participate meaningfully in peace negotiations, the resulting agreements tend to last longer and there is greater satisfaction with the outcome. Hopefully you all will agree with that. Especially in a police force, it's been proven now, it's not just my opinion, that the more female police officers join the force, the less, less investigations related code of conduct are made, and not because there are fewer investigations, it's just because the agents do not commit as many infractions as they used to. Okay? Inequality and exclusion are linked to access to political power and governance, land, water, and extractive resources, delivery of basic services, and justice and security. As the spaces where livelihoods and well-being are defined and defended, access to these arenas can become a matter of life and death. Also, competition for power is an all source of conflict. Power balances and imbalances can put a society at risk of violence. Experience shows that the more inclusive and representative power sharing arrangements lower the risk of violent conflicts. Decentralizing, devolving, or allowing autonomy of subnational regions or groups can help to accommodate diversity and lower the risk of violence at the national level. And I'm telling you that I come from Spain, right, given the tension we've got regionally, okay? The effects of climate change, population growth, and urbanization are intensifying these risks. Disputes over resources have spilled over into violent conflict and instability across the world. Climate change does not cause violent conflicts. However, it does create major stress, especially in fragile situations where governments have limited means to help their populations adapt. As global temperatures rise, conflicts stemming from desertification, land degradation, water scarcity, and food insecurity are increasingly prevalent. People leaving their homes to flee these crises often compete with local populations for scarce resources, exacerbating intercommunal tensions. We see it mostly in the Chad Basin and the Sahel nowadays. The basic function of all police, including the 12,000 AMPOs nowadays deployed to 16 peace operations and political missions, is to protect and to serve the population. Climate change poses one of the most serious threats to regional and global security today, and the police will be on the front lines. Service delivery does not have a direct relationship with violence either, but we covered today how corruption affects the way we deliver services in our societies. When corruption is rampant, prevention is a greater challenge. But I would like to draw your attention to how effective and accountable rule of law and security institutions impact on the prevention spectrum, as they typically lie at the core of any given conflict. Most contemporary conflicts remain internal, rooted in unequal power and resource sharing or an incomplete separation of power. They are fueled by impunity, endemic corruption, violent extremisms, transnational organized crime and terrorism, and increasingly involve non-state groups and regional and international actors. Non-inclusive security institutions lacking accountability and civilian oversight mechanisms can be used to suppress the rights of minorities, but also to overthrow legitimate governments. Moreover, a security vacuum or breakdown of law and order due to weak or ineffective security institutions invites spoilers, extremist groups, and organized crime syndicates to further destabilize fragile security institutions. But we all have a role to play regarding the 2030 agenda, AMPO particularly, on Sustainable Development Goal 16, which, as you may remember, mainly focuses on access to justice, which, as you know, promotes peaceful, inclusive societies for sustainable development and aims to provide access to justice. This includes our efforts to help member states realize effective, representative, responsive, and accountable police services. The new global landscape features significant demographic shifts that may create new stresses, as well as opportunities for global and national systems. Already, there are more young people in the world than at any other time in history. 1.8 billion people between the ages of 10 and 24. There's no one around here, okay? And the vast majority of young people live in low-income countries, many of them already affected by conflict. In Africa, 60% of the population is under the age of 25. Harnessing the potential of a growing young population is an important challenge. In addition, population growth, while a positive force for economies, also puts pressure on labour markets, which will have to absorb the estimated 600 million new workers entering the workforce in the next 10 years. That, of course, bearing in mind the slow and uneven global economic growth that we will see in the future years. Let me just fast forward a little bit, since my time is coming to an end, right? Yesterday, the Security Council held a debate on peace and security in Africa, the centrality of diplomacy, conflict prevention, and resolution. Some members noted that each conflict or crisis situation is unique. We all agree, right? With the constellation of factors playing effective prevention and mediation depending on the context. In this regard, while the Security Council, the African Union, and some regional bodies in Africa are often among the key actors involved in conflict prevention, some Council members also recognize the constructive role that the civil society and member states often play on these issues. It was also emphasized the importance of women and youth, again, in conflict prevention and mediation processes in Africa. In addition, members have increasingly emphasized the positive contribution that youth can make in preventing and resolving conflicts, rather than viewing them more narrowly as a population particularly vulnerable to conflict and the influence of violent extremism. But successful prevention requires considering rule of law and security institutions from the outset. We tend normally to say, okay, first we would just have the military forces, and then as the situation gets better, then we will just have the police and the rule of law, and then the military will phase out, and then the police will take over. Normally that's the narrative we hear in many missions, but we need to consider rule of law from the very beginning a mission, when a mission is deployed. Okay. For example, the possible role of uniformed personnel in a looming conflict, or the role of the judiciary in elections, for instance. The wider region must be considered, for example, threats emanating from transnational organized crime or extremist groups, ineffective border management or clan affiliation of security sector segments. In such contexts, AMPO help build capacity through training and advice, as the need for specialized skills has grown to, for instance, engage community or tackle organized crime. AMPO have increasingly been complemented by civilian experts and a specialized police team from member states. And I would like to conclude using again my first remark, that despite many factors, the ones we covered, climate change, the youth, being more gender responsive, etc., despite so many threats and factors and risks, prevention works. Thank you.
Prevention works. And to be very honest, as being a Dutch guy, and you were closing up with climate change, understanding that, well, somewhere around half of the Netherlands is below sea level, you really make me happy. I know where to start working. Jaime, thank you very much. Thank you for firstly giving us, let's say, a look inside the DPKO, and then talk about, let's say, conflict prevention in general. And of course, all my thoughts also went out to spoiler threats For sure, saving money, spare people the suffering is, let's say, helping with conflict prevention. You talked about 2016, and I was, let's say, a little bit scared about the numbers of having more conflicts than the 30 years before. Are we on the way back? Didn't we hear something about that today before? Something to think about. One of the reasons why we are not so much in conflict prevention is simply because we don't see the crisis before it becomes a conflict. We are not institutionalized on it. It is not in the press. We just don't see it. Well, we see it, but somewhere we don't find it interesting. You talked about the importance of gender. Gender, in my opinion, even wider than talking about men or women. And you gave some examples of lasting agreements. Happy that you took them out, because I think we all need it. And then you came back to climate change again. And you made it quite clear to all of us, and it should be quite clear for the rest of the world, that it's a big challenge. And actually it is a challenge for everybody, because yes, we will get conflicts out of it, as we should actually address it as the conflict with climate change and humanity. Thank you so much. We will go over to the questions we got as soon as I get my microphone. Again, we have more questions. We try to merge it in time, but as you can see, the top question being addressed, let's say, or voted for 10 times. In your opinion, despite increased efforts by the international community, why are conflicts becoming difficult to manage world over? If you can answer this question, you win the prize.
Yeah, and of course this is my opinion. And they are becoming more and more difficult to manage for one simple reason, because they are more because of the globalization of the conflicts. That's conflicts are, have a more regional, and they have to be approached regionally, not only for a single country, but bearing in mind the dynamics of the region. That's why conflicts are becoming more complex. We don't see wars, as you can understand, between two countries, but we see internal conflicts that have that somehow affects the whole region. We see it in the Sahel, and we see it in many other areas in the world. That's why, in my opinion, are difficult to manage even more nowadays.
And then, as the UN representative, do you sustain a shareable methodology to assess the spoiler threat? Yeah. Interesting one, isn't it?
I'd say that given the thematic I just discussed or I presented, more than assess, of course, the spoiler threat is very important. But what I like to say is, what I do consider even more important than that is an early warning mechanism. For us, and we're also working with the European Union in that regard. We need an early warning mechanism that tells us, okay, these are the indicators for this country, we need to act now. Are we doing it? Is the international community fast, let's say, enough to act once the indicators are there? Not yet, I have to say, but there is this kind of approach, and that is, for the time being, important.
Just to make it a little bit sharp, if I may, coming back on your last answer, you said an early warning indicator. Going back to your speech, didn't you say that actually the signs are there, but we just don't, we don't take care?
Yeah.
So how does that relate to having an indicator, or let's say acting on what's already there? Do we need the indicator, or do we need to act?
No, we do need to do something about the indicator. Mm-hmm. The indicator's there. We notice the indicator, but we need to react, in a quicker, let's say, manner. That's the problem nowadays. That getting everyone together, everyone to agree to doing something, it takes maybe a long time, maybe too late. Yeah.
Okay. Has DPO developed a spoiler assessment methodology, or is there a process in motion to develop one? Actually, the question is, do you have an assessment? Do you have an instrument? Is it part of a planning process? Or you know it's there, but, well, simply it is, let's say, not focused on yet?
We have developed quite a few, let's say, kind of, we wouldn't call it spoiler assessment methodology. It's kind of rule of law indicators, etc., right? But to be honest, they're not being used widely across the system. Maybe we need to rethink about it and put it back in place. Maybe adapt it, fine-tune it, but put it back in place, as I said.
Yeah, just to comment on the last answer you have, and I'm quite happy with it. Of course, we are all together here on the spoiler threats, and all 4 organizations, before we organized the conference, already acknowledged the importance of having a good tool in place, and also spoke out their need and willingness to work together. So, well, not a check, but it does fit what we agreed on in the beginning. So I'm quite happy with that answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for your speech. And what we will do is a short summary, and also asking if there are any reactions from our speakers of today, their reactions, and after that we will close the day. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we at the moment are missing at the podium 2 panel members for the right reasons. Well, I'm not the one that should decide if it's the right reason or not, but the rest of the panel members are here. We're going to close the conference, and I want to do that with showing you and the panel members on that screen. You can use that screen, but I wouldn't. We have a lot of outcomes on the conference, and all these outcomes are going to be the input on the workshop. And you know, the input on the workshop is going to have an output for a new working group in which the AU, EU, NATO, and the UN will together think about a possibility or getting closer in order to develop a spoiler threat assessment. So, a lot of outcomes, main outcomes. We saw the importance of the assessment of the spoiler threats during the international missions planning process. The importance of a shareable methodology tool to assess the spoiler threats, which should be, let's say, not a very big surprise, otherwise the whole conference would be, let's say, The role of both international and local police forces in assessing the spoiler threats. It was also in the presentation that we said, hey, we need everybody and everything in there. And the possibility, which we will take in consideration, but that should be, of course, at the end in the working groups, of merging existing and presented spoiler threats assessment methodologies. I don't want to put this into discussion because then we're going to do the whole conference again. However, I would ask the panel members if at this moment they think that they should address on one of the outcomes, of the main outcomes. If they would like to, as they say in a wedding room, speak now or you will never be heard again. Well, it's not that hard, but then. If so, please let me know. Michael, please, microphone is just on your left-hand side.
The third item, the role of both, sorry, that one wasn't working, okay. The role of both international and local police forces in assessing spoiler threats. And in many, if not most cases, well, the local police forces will be part of the spoiler threat. But if they are, asking them, A, asking that question tips them off, and B, the answer that we're going to get from them is not going to be of any value. So I would not include local police force.
Two finger on that. I would not include them as a whole. But if you can find and select, for example, some of the individuals that you were talking about, one of the questions I wanted to ask you is whether you have done any link analysis on any of those leaders that you find for the moment not to be showing any signs of corruption. And so that's, I just sort of throw out there. But the point being, one can find patriotic, and by this I mean real public servants within the police. But the issue has to be identifying them, separating them out from the rest of the incentive structure, protecting them, providing them incentives that don't have to be exclusively material, but material helps. I mean, it's nice if they have a salary that allows them to feel like they can stand on their 2 feet, but also pride, pride of the product of their work and things like that, but most fundamentally backup when they do actually take you at your word, take on some of these spoilers, and get in hot water. Then are you there behind them? So I would just say, agreed 100% that to think of the local police as a monolith could be very dangerous to a spoiler threat assessment. But identifying and isolating that next generation that you were talking about, providing them with the capabilities and the backup and the pride to do this type of work would be essential, because often they do know more than we do about what's happening on the ground.
Is this a 3-finger? NATO's been there for 18 years. In most cases, the international community, whoever it is, doesn't have any long-standing relationships. I mean, we don't have the knowledge about who the trustworthy police might be or not, so that would be difficult to accomplish. However, we certainly should talk to NGOs, and I mean, not all, because some of them might also be spoilers, but there are international NGOs that are present on the ground in conflict settings, and asking them questions it could be a compromising issue for them as well, because they're supposed to be neutral. But nevertheless, there are sources, other sources that we should consider in the host nation.
If I may, 3,000 leaders have gone through American educational establishments. Afghan leaders have gone through American educational establishments. I don't know how many have gone through UK and other countries around the world, but there's a huge network of understanding about the quality, motives, and education of Afghan's leaders over the last 20 years that we failed to harness. And there is a great wealth of knowledge about Afghan's leaders at every level that we've gained over the last 20 years. The problem is we've never really harnessed it and brought it together. There have been attempts, and we still operate attempts on all the leaders, so there's assessment going on all of those guys I showed in huge detail, and as you go further down the scale, there's less assessment, but it's still there to assess the chances of corruption, whether they're reliable partners, a whole sort of series of different themes. But it's probably never come together as a sort of effective repository that links in a sort of fusion cell, intelligence, all of those assets. It's been more of an ad hoc system. But the information's out there. We just, where's our big data analytics? Where's the work that should bring it all together? It's never quite taken off.
Yeah, and I would even challenge whether the knowledge is actually there. I mean, I think, again, maybe things have developed significantly in the last, 8-9 years, quite possibly, but there was in 2011 something called the Network Effect Cell, which was the first time I ever saw anything like that in a NATO headquarters, and where link analysis was being done of our, quote, friends, as well as, I just am not sure we are asking the right questions of the people that we go into a situation assuming that we're allied with. And so I'm not positive that the information is even there, that the right questions are being asked of them. And certainly I would agree that that information isn't then stored in a transferable form that can be transferred from one rotation to the next and added to, and that the dynamics of these networks and their memberships are being accounted for. That I certainly agree with.
If I can just second what you said, I actually do training for the Ministry of Defense advisors on corruption. And I've asked them to provide feedback on who the champions of reform are. So that would be one item of information I think would be very important for us to try to, in Afghanistan where we have such a repository of knowledge, but that knowledge hasn't been captured, so it should be. The second thing for our workshop is that I think Oscar mentioned that he during his presentation, that he has ways, methodologies for determining whether informants, if you will, in thinking of in terms of criminal intelligence, but simply people with whom you are working, whether they are trustworthy or not. And we should discuss, you know, how to do that so that we can identify who the true champions are.
As being a little bit autistic, I'm going back to the question and all the things that were being said. And what it tells me that the main outcome as we wrote it down needs to be rephrased, and we will. What I think I heard is that is being said, actually, in assessing spoiler threats in the process, there should be a role of all actors. However, it should be discussed and you should be aware which role should be with whom at what time. And this is being said very fastly, of course, and it needs to be worked out, which is clear. But that I think this is what it learns me.
Can I also say that the end goal when the mission leaves is ownership, right?
Yes.
If we exclude police forces from the very beginning, once we leave, they are not in the picture. They're not in the equation. Yeah. So, of course, maybe not at the beginning, and maybe depending on the context, maybe Afghanistan is not the best example, as I heard today. But in other missions, I do believe that because of ownership, they should be included. Maybe not from the beginning, but as the capacity building of the forces evolve.
Something like that.
Yeah. Now, clear what you say. I fully agree. We'll try to merge it in that way. Role for everyone, every organization, time, moment, importance of the role, etc. But give us time to rephrase it. By the way, we won't do it now. Michael?
Just wanted to thank you for the comment, because the ultimate goal is local ownership, but the challenge is, what if the police force that you're working with is a spoiler? So how do we get from that to a police force that is trustworthy, that we can transition to? And that's a huge challenge that I would propose that be the next topic for us to be discussing and developing lessons learned for.
So thank you. Any other last remarks on the other main outcomes from our panel?
I could just one other from me.
Please.
I think something that needs addressing, and it's very difficult, is the role of intelligence agencies and intelligence, because that can have some of the most important information, and the challenges of disseminating that information are huge, and it causes all sorts of really difficult frictions. So there's no easy answer, but I think the role of, it's something that needs discussing and understanding, and a mechanism in place that people understand why they're included or excluded, and who gets to see everything or nothing and why, and the challenge between multilaterals, bilaterals and single entities in that field, and locals. Thank you.
David, got it? You got it. Sara.
That's great, because you're inviting us to look at what's not even included among those.
Again, these are the 4 main outcomes. We have around 20.
Of course, okay. But one that I think might be worth being on the main ones is this issue of the vertical integration. What you don't see here is the vertical integration both of the systems on the ground and of ours, and how do we as working level people deal with systems both on our, oh, is this one not working? Okay. How do we as working level people deal with the reticence or even collusion with the spoilers of the very top of the system in the host country and also our own. And that's maybe one of the biggest challenges of this type of work. I'm not saying it's easy to find a solution to that, but if you don't include it in the issues, we're all going to get basically our knees chopped out from under us when it turns out that our president or our prime minister or whatever is not interested in addressing this problem.
Clear. Andrew.
Thank you. We touched upon the, of course, necessary but so challenging endeavor of a common methodology between organizations and interinstitutions. And challenging, yes, but I think there are definitely prospects in developing at least common, flexible sets of tools rather than something of a doctrine that would need an institutional endorsement in several organizations. As we also come across the differences in different geographical contexts, that what is an appropriate approach in one theater may not be the recommended one in another.
So, short reaction on that. As the SPCOE, we are going to facilitate the process. The 4 organizations who were there this afternoon are going to develop whatever is going to be developed. I don't know the name. We're saying instrument, tool, doctrine, whatever. So to be very honest, and I know it's a little bit mean, but I'm throwing it back, it's up to you guys. It's up to the 4 organizations that were this afternoon. And as the SPC, we will support, organize, bring in everything we can, but it has to work. Otherwise, it's nothing. So thank you very much for that, because it's already the step in the direction we can. And yes, it's going to be difficult, but therefore even nicer. Okay. I didn't see anybody jumping around anymore. Give me the mic. Then it's now time for me to thank our panel members. Thank you for helping the 4 organizations. The 4 organizations, thank you for helping us. The public, with the questions, which we all have, thank you for making us sharp. And we are going to have the job to make something out of it, and we will. It will happen, and we need ambition, otherwise we will not get anywhere. So I don't want to be distracted in that. It doesn't help. So thank you for what I think was a wonderful day. It was a long day. Generally, at the end of the day, it's time for the end of the day. So this is still the same day that it is the end of the day. However, I'm stepping out inspired and motivated, and I really loved it. Thank you very much. I wish you a very good trip home or a dinner or wherever you go. After I'm ready, I am asking the members of the SPCOE to stay within the room. Thank you again, and for the people tomorrow, work hard, have a beautiful day, and thank you again. Goodbye, everybody.